At my own son's wedding reception, his new bride shoved my wife into the mud in front of 200 guests. My son just laughed and wrapped his arm around her. So I walked up to the microphone and said something that made her father drop his champagne glass. My name is Lawrence. I am 69 years old, and I spent my entire life building a legacy that my son decided to spit on. Before I tell you how I tore his world apart, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned, not freely given. The afternoon sun was setting over the historic garden estate, casting a golden glow over the expensive floral arrangements and the crystal chandeliers hanging from the ancient oak trees. Valerie, my beautiful wife of 40 years, was struggling to navigate the uneven grass. Her multiple sclerosis had been flaring up, making her steps heavy and uncertain even with the help of her cane. She was trying to reach her seat at the family table when her foot accidentally caught the edge of Megan's long trailing wedding gown. There was a faint sound of fabric pulling. Megan spun around her face, twisting with sudden rage. She did not ask if Valerie was okay. She did not gently pull her dress away. Instead, Megan planted both her hands squarely on Valerie's shoulders and shoved her backward with violent force. Valerie stumbled, her cane slipping on the damp grass, and fell hard into a muddy patch near the flower beds. The heavy thud of her fall echoed over the soft string music. I froze for a fraction of a second, my heart hammering against my ribs. I expected Brandon to rush to his mother to help her up to scold his bride. Instead, Brandon looked down at the mud staining his mother's dress, let out a loud mocking laugh, and pulled Megan close to his side. He whispered something completely cruel in her ear, entirely ignoring the fragile woman who gave him his very life and abandoned her. I did not scream, I did not rush forward and create a scene. Decades of running board meetings had taught me that the loudest person in the room is always the weakest. I simply stood still and allowed the well-trained catering staff to carefully lift Valerie from the mud. A young waiter with kind eyes handed her a clean towel while she wept softly in utter humiliation. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for us to just leave quietly and go back home. But I was not going to let this pass, not this time. My silence was not surrender. It was the calm before absolute devastation. Everyone in that beautiful garden, including my son, believed I was just a retired plumber living on a meager pension. They believed my quiet demeanor meant I was powerless. They had absolutely no idea that I was the sole owner of the vast real estate trust that owned this very venue, along with half the commercial properties in the city. I smoothed my jacket, walked past the whispering guests, and climbed the 3 wooden steps to the band stage. The string quartet stopped playing as I approached. I reached out and took the microphone from the stand. The high-pitched whine of feedback cut through the tense air, making several guests cover their ears. 200 faces turned toward me. The wealthy white relatives on Megan's side looked at me with expressions of pure disdain and thinly veiled racism. Thomas, Megan's arrogant father, stood near the front with a smug look on his face, holding his expensive champagne. He clearly expected the poor working-class black father to deliver a pathetic, tearful apology for ruining his daughter's perfect aesthetic. Brandon crossed his arms, rolling his eyes as if my mere presence on stage was a tremendous burden to him. I looked directly at my son. I saw the absolute arrogance in his posture, the complete lack of respect for his roots, and the shameful way he had discarded the mother who sacrificed everything to put him through college. He wanted to play the role of a self-made elite while treating us like dirt. I took a very slow, deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill my lungs, and brought the microphone close to my lips. I was about to give them exactly what they asked for, but not in the way any of them expected. My silence was the only weapon I needed right now. I stared down at the crowd, letting the heavy, uncomfortable quiet stretch for a few more agonizing seconds. The sheer entitlement radiating from these people was suffocating, but they were standing on my land. I spoke clearly and firmly, my voice booming across the garden estate. I told the crowd that there had been a severe misunderstanding regarding the funding of this magnificent event. I announced that effective immediately, the financial guarantee holding this entire reception together was permanently revoked. I stated that the open bar was closed, the catering staff was dismissed, and the rental contract for the venue was officially terminated due to a gross violation of basic human decency. The band members instantly lowered their instruments. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the lawn, broken only by the sound of the evening wind rustling the oak trees. Thomas turned completely pale. He slammed his expensive champagne glass onto a nearby cocktail table, shattering the crystal into dozens of jagged pieces. He stepped forward, his face flushed with sudden, uncontrollable rage. He pointed a trembling finger at me, shouting that I was a crazy old man and demanding that the music continue playing. He screamed that he had personally paid a massive fortune to rent this historic estate, and he would not allow a bitter, ungrateful father to ruin his daughter's special day. But his panic was already visible. He knew exactly what he was hiding. Megan had never paid the venue. She had taken his money, spent it on her own massive debts, and given him fake invoices, assuming my unlimited credit line would quietly cover the entire event without anyone ever noticing. Now that safety net was gone, completely pulled out from under them in front of 200 elite guests. Brandon marched toward the stage, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. He ordered me to step down and stop embarrassing him in front of his important tech investors. He demanded that I apologize to his bride and fix the situation before he cut me out of his life forever. I looked down at him with absolute pity. I told him that he had already cut himself out of my life the moment he laughed at his mother's pain. I informed the crowd that they had exactly 15 minutes to vacate the private property before law enforcement arrived to remove trespassers. The resulting chaos was immediate and beautiful. Guests began whispering frantically, grabbing their coats and heading for the valet parking. Megan's friends started crying. Thomas was screaming at the event manager, who was already instructing his staff to pack up the tables. Brandon stood completely paralyzed in the middle of the lawn, finally realizing that the endless well of financial support he had secretly relied upon his entire adult life was now completely dry. I walked off the stage, offered my arm to my beautiful wife Valerie, and gently escorted her toward the exit, leaving my arrogant son and his new family drowning in the exact mess they had created for themselves. The echo of my announcement was still ringing through the garden speakers when Thomas finally snapped. He shoved past a row of stunned guests, knocking over a silver tray of champagne glasses in his blind fury. The sharp crash of breaking crystal did nothing to slow his momentum as he stomped aggressively toward the wooden stage. His face was a dark mottled red and the veins in his neck bulged against his tight silk collar. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my chest. He climbed the stairs with heavy stomping boots, entirely abandoning the polished country club persona he had maintained all evening. He stepped so close to me that I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath and the nervous sweat soaking through his designer tuxedo. He raised his fist, shaking it inches from my face, and screamed that I had lost my absolute mind. He told me I was nothing but a jealous, broke old man trying to ruin a high society event because I could not afford to belong in it. He turned to the crowd and shouted that he had personally written a check for $50,000 to cover half of this luxury estate rental. He pounded his chest and declared that this was his daughter's night, his investment, and his territory. He leaned back in and threatened to break my jaw if I did not immediately step down from the microphone and apologize to his little girl. The guests gasped in collective shock. Thomas then turned to the side of the stage and began waving frantically at the venue staff. He screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding that they call the police and have me thrown off the property immediately for trespassing and disturbing the peace. He bellowed that he was a paying customer and I was just an unwanted pest. He demanded physical force. He wanted me dragged out through the mud in front of my own son to complete the ultimate humiliation. His eyes were wild with uncontrolled aristocratic rage. The heavy wooden doors of the main estate house swung open, and 4 large security guards in tailored black suits stepped out into the garden. They moved quickly across the lawn, their earpieces glowing in the dimming light. Thomas saw them approaching and immediately started shouting orders, pointing at me with a triumphant smirk. He commanded them to grab me by the collar and throw me into the street. The lead guard, a tall man named Marcus, walked directly up the stage steps. Thomas stepped aside, waiting for the satisfying sight of my forceful removal. Instead, Marcus walked straight past Thomas, completely ignoring his frantic commands, and stopped right beside me. He crossed his hands in front of him and gave me a slight, respectful nod. The smirk on Thomas' face vanished instantly, replaced by sheer confusion. He demanded to know what Marcus was doing. That was when I slowly reached into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out a solid black metal identification card engraved with a gold crest. I held it up so the evening lights caught the gold lettering. I looked Thomas dead in the eye and explained the reality of his situation. I told him that the check he wrote for $50,000 never went to the estate management. I told him to look closely at his precious daughter. Megan was standing near the front row, clutching her muddy wedding dress, her face completely drained of blood. I spoke into the microphone so every single person could hear the devastating truth. I revealed that Megan had completely fabricated the venue invoices. She had forged the letterhead stamped fake approval codes and handed those fraudulent documents to her father to steal his money. She used his $50,000 to pay off her hidden credit card debts and fund her lavish bachelorette trip. I explained that she never paid a single dime to rent this property because she knew she did not have to. She knew this because my trust owned the entire historic estate. I was the sole proprietor of the land they were standing on. I did not just rent the garden. I owned the dirt, the trees, the mansion, and the security team. Thomas turned slowly to look at his daughter. Megan took a step back, shaking her head, but unable to form a single word of denial. The absolute horror on Thomas' face as he realized his own flesh and blood had robbed him blind was a picture of perfect poetic justice. I did not give them a single moment to recover from the shock. I raised my voice, allowing the raw authority I had built over 40 years in business to command the space. I announced that because the bride had committed blatant financial fraud and physically assaulted my disabled wife, their presence was no longer tolerated on my property. I looked at my gold watch and gave them exactly 15 minutes to pack their belongings and leave the premises before I had them formally charged with trespassing. The garden erupted into absolute chaos. The remaining illusion of high society elegance shattered into a million pieces. Wealthy relatives began shoving each other trying to reach the exit gates before the police arrived. Women in expensive gowns tripped over lawn chairs in their desperate rush to flee the sinking ship. The catering staff immediately began pulling tablecloths and taking away half-eaten plates of food, completely ignoring the shouting guests. Thomas grabbed Megan by the arm, screaming at her, demanding to know where his money went, his face purple with a fresh wave of betrayal. Megan burst into loud, ugly sobs, completely abandoning her poised bridal persona. In the middle of this beautiful disaster, Brandon finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He marched aggressively toward the stage, his face twisted in a mixture of profound embarrassment and furious entitlement. He pointed his finger at me, screaming that I had destroyed his life. He yelled that he would never forgive me for humiliating him in front of his important tech investors and his new affluent family. He screamed that I was dead to him, that he would never speak to me again, and that I would never see my future grandchildren. He promised to make me regret this night for the rest of my miserable, lonely life. I simply stood there looking down at the frantic, furious little boy I had somehow raised. I felt no anger toward him anymore. I only felt a cold, quiet emptiness. Dozens of smartphones were suddenly raised in the air, recording every second of his pathetic meltdown. The bright flashes of phone cameras illuminated his furious face, capturing the definitive end of his social climbing masquerade. He realized people were filming his disgrace. He covered his face, swore loudly, and turned away, sprinting toward the parking lot and leaving his weeping, fraudulent bride behind to face her furious father. The humiliation was absolute, total, and permanent. My security team formed a solid line, slowly advancing across the grass to ensure the swift departure of the remaining crowd. I watched the taillights of their luxury cars speeding away down my private driveway. The first wave of consequence had officially crashed over them. But this was only the beginning. The cool night air was a welcome relief after the stifling heat of the garden. I held Valerie's hand securely as we walked away from the glaring lights of the main estate and headed toward the far end of the gravel parking lot. My vintage pickup truck sat quietly in the shadows, a stark contrast to the fleeing luxury sedans and sports cars clogging the main driveway. I unlocked the passenger side and gently helped my wife into the seat, ensuring she was comfortable. Just as I walked around to the driver's side, a heavy hand slammed onto the hood of my truck. The loud metallic thud echoed in the quiet corner of the lot. I turned to see Brandon standing there, chest heaving, his tuxedo jacket completely unbuttoned and his tie hanging loosely around his neck. The sheer audacity of this boy was astounding. Despite the absolute public humiliation he had just experienced, his greed overpowered his embarrassment. He stepped right into my personal space, blocking my path to the door. He held out his open palm toward me, his eyes wide with a manic, frantic energy. He demanded the keys. He actually had the nerve to demand the keys to the downtown luxury penthouse I had promised him months ago as his ultimate wedding gift. He told me that regardless of what happened inside the venue, a promise was a promise. He screamed that I had ruined his reception, humiliated his new wife, and destroyed his relationship with his father-in-law. He declared that I owed him this property as compensation for the immense emotional damage I had caused him tonight. He insisted that I hand over the deed and the keys right this second so he and Megan could at least salvage their wedding night in the penthouse. He warned me that if I withheld his gift, he would sue me for breach of verbal contract. His jaw was clenched tight and he thrust his open hand closer to my face, expecting me to simply cave to his ridiculous demands just as he blindly assumed I always did in the past. I looked at his outstretched hand and felt an overwhelming sense of profound disappointment. I did not argue with him, nor did I raise my voice to match his frantic tone. Instead, I calmly reached into the inside pocket of my coat for the second time that evening. I did not pull out a heavy brass keyring or a leather-bound property deed. I pulled out a single neatly folded piece of white paper. I placed it directly into his waiting palm. Brandon snatched it eagerly, his eyes lighting up for a brief second before he unfolded it under the dim, yellow glow of the parking lot street lamp. His triumphant expression immediately melted into a mask of pure confusion and then absolute horror. It was a formal bank notice of immediate credit revocation. For the past 6 years, Brandon had been parading around the city flashing a heavy metallic black card to impress his tech friends, his investors, and his shallow new wife. He let everyone believe that he was a self-made millionaire genius who had qualified for the highest tier of elite banking all on his own merit. He had convinced himself of that lie too. But the document in his hand outlined the brutal reality he had conveniently ignored. That exclusive black card was never his. It was merely an authorized user card linked directly to my primary massive hidden trust account. I was the primary account holder, the sole guarantor, and the only person with the actual power to approve or deny the enormous credit limits he exploited daily. For years, I had silently paid his exorbitant rent, covered the enormous losses his failing tech company generated, and bought every expensive gift he ever gave to Megan. I had secretly subsidized his luxurious lifestyle, his expensive dinners, and his designer suits while allowing him to take all the credit. I explained to him in a slow, measured voice that the penthouse was indeed purchased through that very trust, but since he was no longer an authorized beneficiary, the property would remain under my sole control forever. I watched his eyes dart wildly back and forth across the printed words, trying to find a loophole that simply did not exist. I told him that I had officially contacted the bank exactly 20 minutes ago, right before I stepped onto that wooden stage. I had permanently severed his access to every single dollar associated with my name. I calmly opened the heavy steel door to my vintage truck and climbed into the driver's seat, leaving him standing alone in the cold dark, staring blankly at the formal paper that officially confirmed his absolute and total financial ruin. As I started the engine of my truck, I watched the next phase of their nightmare unfold through my rearview mirror. Megan came sprinting across the gravel lot, her muddy wedding dress dragging heavily behind her. She was desperately clutching her designer purse, followed closely by an annoyed valet driver. They stopped right next to a luxury sports car parked near the exit. It was a massive, expensive vehicle Brandon had rented exclusively for their grand getaway to the penthouse. I knew exactly how that rental had been secured. Megan had eagerly placed it on her own black card, a secondary authorized account I had generously issued to her as a welcoming gift. Megan aggressively shoved the card into the portable payment terminal the valet held out to cover the parking and rental security deposit fees. The small machine beeped loudly, displaying a bright red error message. Declined. She scowled, muttering something about a bank error, and snatched the card back, wiping the chip on her dress before forcefully jamming it into the reader a second time. The machine beeped again, louder this time. Declined. The valet driver let out a heavy sigh, crossing his arms and shaking his head. Megan began screaming at the poor young man, demanding he run it again, insisting she was wealthy. But her wealth was an absolute illusion that I had just permanently shattered. The situation escalated rapidly as the wailing sound of approaching sirens cut through the night air. A local police cruiser pulled directly into the parking lot, its flashing blue and red lights sweeping across the dark gravel. I had flagged both of their credit cards for suspected fraud immediately after revoking their authorized access. The rental company had automatically triggered an alert when the massive security deposit failed to authorize on a vehicle that was scheduled to leave the premises. 2 uniformed officers stepped out of their cruiser and approached the sports car. They informed Megan and the approaching Brandon that the vehicle was being officially impounded due to immediate payment failure and suspected credit fraud. Megan shrieked in absolute disbelief, stamping her muddy feet on the ground like a spoiled toddler. Brandon rushed over, waving his useless revocation letter, trying to explain the situation to the officers, but they completely ignored his frantic excuses. A heavy-duty tow truck rolled into the lot right behind the police cruiser. Within a matter of minutes, the sleek sports car was hooked up and hoisted into the air. I shifted my truck into drive and slowly rolled past them. I watched my son and his new bride standing completely stranded on the side of the dark road surrounded by the flashing police lights. They had no money, no car, no penthouse, and no family left to exploit. The long walk to reality was finally beginning. The bright morning sun rose over the busy city, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban streets. Inside a cheap, dingy motel room on the outskirts of town, my son was already awake and seething with absolute rage. Brandon sat on the edge of a stained mattress, staring at the cracked screen of his laptop. The humiliation of the previous night was still burning freshly in his mind. He had been stripped of his rented sports car, kicked out of his own wedding reception, and forced to sleep in a roadside motel because his new wife had absolutely zero money to her name and no family support. Megan was asleep beside him, snoring softly, completely unaware of the financial apocalypse that had just destroyed their lives. Brandon was not thinking about how to apologize or how to rebuild his life honestly. He was only thinking about revenge. He wanted to punish me for exposing him, and he desperately needed immediate cash to maintain his fraudulent lifestyle. He opened a new browser window and navigated to a familiar banking portal. Years ago, when my wife first became ill, I had given Brandon the login credentials to what he believed was my primary retirement savings account. I had told him it was just a modest emergency fund to be used only if something terrible happened to me. He typed in the username and password, his fingers striking the keys with aggressive force. He saw an available balance of $80,000. In his arrogant mind, that money was already his inheritance. He felt completely justified in taking it right now. He quickly set up a wire transfer to funnel $50,000 directly into his own hidden offshore account that he had opened last year. He wanted to leave me with barely enough to survive, just to teach me a lesson about power and respect. He sneered at the screen, believing he had finally found the perfect way to strike back and cripple me financially. He hovered his cursor over the final confirmation button, completely blinded by his own toxic entitlement, and clicked submit without a single ounce of hesitation or remorse. The web page did not immediately redirect to a standard transfer confirmation screen as expected. Instead, a gray loading circle appeared in the center of his monitor, spinning endlessly for several long, agonizing seconds. Brandon tapped his fingers impatiently against the plastic keyboard, muttering angry curses under his breath. Suddenly, the screen flashed bright red and a bold notification popped up stating that the transaction had been immediately flagged, blocked, and frozen due to a severe internal security violation. His account access was instantly locked and revoked. Across town, in the quiet comfort of my own home study, I was peacefully drinking my morning coffee when my encrypted, secure cell phone sitting on the desk began to ring loudly. I looked down at the caller identification and saw the name of my lead corporate attorney, Jonathan, flashing on the bright digital display. I answered the call on the very first ring. Jonathan did not bother with pleasantries or polite morning greetings. He spoke in a crisp, professional tone, confirming that the digital bait we laid out had just been taken by our target. He informed me that my son had just attempted to initiate a massive unauthorized wire transfer of $50,000 to an unverified offshore banking destination. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee, feeling an incredible sense of vindication wash over me. I had fully anticipated this exact cowardly move. I knew Brandon possessed a deeply flawed character and a total lack of basic moral boundaries. 6 months ago, when I first began noticing strange discrepancies in the accounting logs of his failing startup company, I realized he was actively stealing from his own investors. Rather than confront him directly and listen to his endless, pathetic lies, I quietly instructed Jonathan to set up a highly advanced cybersecurity trap. The retirement account Brandon just logged into was completely fake. It was a sophisticated digital honeypot designed entirely to monitor his actions and record his unique computer address. I had deliberately funded it with $80,000 of untouchable dummy capital just to see if his overwhelming greed would ultimately override his basic human conscience. I gave him the keys to the vault simply to see if he would become a thief. He failed the test spectacularly. Jonathan informed me that the security software had successfully captured his exact location, the physical street address of the cheap roadside motel he was currently hiding in, and a complete digital footprint of the attempted theft. I instructed Jonathan to proceed with the next phase of our operation without any further hesitation or mercy whatsoever. I hung up the phone and looked out my window at the peaceful neighborhood. The invisible steel trap had successfully snapped shut. While Brandon was still violently mashing the keys of his laptop, Trying desperately to refresh the completely frozen browser window, an automated email dropped into his primary inbox with a loud pinging sound. The subject line was written in bold capital letters indicating an immediate federal security alert. Because my retirement account was officially registered under a Senior Citizen Protection Act, the cyber honeypot was tethered to a federal banking monitoring system. The moment his unauthorized $50,000 wire transfer was initiated, the system automatically flagged it as a severe case of suspected elder financial abuse and grand theft. The email coldly informed him that his personal banking profile had been submitted to federal authorities for a mandatory criminal review and active investigation. Brandon stared at the screen, his mouth falling open in absolute terror, as the terrifying reality of his situation finally settled in. He was no longer just a spoiled, ungrateful son throwing a pathetic, childish tantrum. He had officially committed a major felony against a protected senior citizen. In his reckless, arrogant desire to teach me a lesson and steal my money, he had handed us the exact weapon we needed to destroy him completely. Back at his downtown law firm, Jonathan was already sitting calmly at his large mahogany desk, his fingers flying rapidly across his keyboard as he drafted the formal criminal complaint. Every single piece of digital evidence, from the precise timestamp of the login to the exact destination routing number of Brandon's hidden offshore account, was being meticulously compiled into an airtight, undeniable legal document. Jonathan prepared the filing to be sent directly to the district attorney, ensuring that there would be no possibility of a quiet settlement or a polite family resolution. I was not going to give my son a slap on the wrist. I was going to give him a lengthy and brutal federal prison sentence. The trap was absolutely flawless. Meanwhile, inside the dingy motel room, the heavy weight of the impending federal investigation was completely ignored by the woman sharing his bed. Megan finally rolled over on the stained mattress, groaning loudly as the morning sunlight hit her face. She sat up, running a hand through her messy blonde hair, and looked around the disgusting room with pure disgust. She turned to Brandon, completely oblivious to the federal crime he had just committed, and began screaming at him about their living conditions. She demanded that he immediately pull funds from his supposedly successful tech startup to buy her a luxury mansion today. She told him she refused to spend another hour living like a peasant and ordered him to call his investors to demand more money. The ultimate irony was that her selfish, relentless greed was about to instantly trigger the next massive, devastating explosion in their rapidly collapsing fake world. Megan paced the worn carpet of the dingy motel room like a caged animal. Her expensive high heels clicked aggressively against the cheap laminate flooring near the bathroom door. She had spent the last 2 hours screaming at the top of her lungs, completely ignoring the irritated pounds on the wall from the neighboring room. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Brandon, who was sitting on the edge of the stained mattress, clutching his head in his hands. Megan demanded to know why they were still breathing the stale air of this disgusting roadside trap when he supposedly ran a tech startup valued at over $5 million. She completely dismissed his frantic explanations about frozen bank accounts and federal investigations, treating his mounting legal terror as nothing more than a pathetic excuse to deny her the luxury she deserved. She told him that she did not marry a poor man to live like a fugitive. She demanded that he immediately contact his company financial officer and illegally pull cash from the corporate accounts to buy her a sprawling mansion in the gated community she had already picked out online. Brandon tried to explain that the seed money was strictly locked into a corporate escrow account to be used exclusively for software development and server architecture. He warned her that siphoning corporate funds for personal real estate was a massive violation of his fiduciary duty and could land him in even more legal trouble. Megan let out a shrill, mocking laugh. She told him that he was the chief executive officer and he could do whatever he wanted with the company money. She crossed her arms and delivered a cold, final ultimatum. She promised to walk out that cheap laminate door file for an immediate annulment and publicly ruin his reputation on social media if he did not secure a luxury home by the end of the day. Driven by absolute panic and his toxic desire to please this demanding woman, Brandon finally caved to her reckless demands. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his hands shaking wildly, preparing to make a call. Brandon walked into the tiny, cramped bathroom and locked the flimsy door behind him to escape Megan's piercing voice. He sat down on the closed toilet seat, taking a deep, shaky breath to steady his rapidly beating heart. He scrolled past his list of regular contacts, ignoring the barrage of angry text messages from his own board members. Instead, he navigated to a highly encrypted private number saved under a generic corporate pseudonym. 2 years ago, when his software company was on the absolute brink of total bankruptcy, a mysterious angel investor had swooped in out of nowhere. This anonymous benefactor, operating strictly through a maze of shell companies and corporate lawyers, had injected a massive $5 million seed round into the failing business. Brandon had never met the man face-to-face, communicating only through encrypted voice channels during quarterly financial reviews. He firmly believed this wealthy stranger respected his genius and would easily authorize an emergency discretionary withdrawal to save his personal life. He pressed the green call button and held the phone tightly to his ear, praying for a quick rescue. The line rang twice before clicking open. Brandon immediately launched into a pathetic, desperate pitch. He spoke rapidly, sweating under the harsh fluorescent bathroom light, begging the anonymous investor to temporarily unlock the escrow account and wire him $2 million in unrestricted personal funds. He lied effortlessly, claiming the money was urgently needed to secure a vital new office headquarters that would revolutionize their market presence. He promised astronomical returns and begged for immediate financial relief. He paused, wiping sweat from his forehead, waiting for the deep, unfamiliar corporate voice he was accustomed to hearing on these calls. Instead, the voice that responded was startlingly familiar, perfectly calm, and absolutely devastating. It was my voice. I was sitting comfortably in my leather study chair, staring at the live corporate dashboard on my computer screen. I spoke directly into my secure encrypted phone, stripping away the electronic voice distortion software I had used for the past 2 years. I greeted my son using his full given name, completely dropping the facade. I told him that I was deeply disappointed but entirely unsurprised by his blatant attempt to commit corporate fraud to satisfy a greedy woman. Brandon stopped breathing. The utter silence on his end of the phone was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. The invisible empire he thought he had built with his own superior intellect was actually entirely owned, funded, and controlled by the very father he had publicly discarded. He was never a brilliant visionary leading a tech revolution. He was just a foolish boy playing a rigged game. Game over. I did not give Brandon the opportunity to formulate another pathetic excuse or beg for my forgiveness. The time for parental leniency had officially expired the moment he watched his mother fall into the mud. I spoke with the cold, detached authority of a corporate chairman executing a hostile takeover. I informed him that our investment contract contained a very specific morality clause, which allowed the primary investor to immediately pull all funding if the chief executive officer engaged in unethical conduct, criminal behavior, or attempted financial fraud. By explicitly asking me to illegally wire corporate escrow funds into his personal bank account, he had just handed me the legal authority to trigger that exact clause. I told him that I was exercising my right to dissolve our partnership effective immediately. I pressed a single key on my computer keyboard and watched the dashboard screen flash as the massive $5 million seed round was legally yanked back from his corporate holding account and securely transferred back into my private trust. I calmly narrated the process to him over the phone, explaining that his company accounts were now at zero. The entire foundation of his arrogant startup had just been permanently eradicated in a matter of seconds. The software he was developing, the expensive office lease he had signed, and the inflated salaries he owed his employees were now entirely his personal responsibility to pay with money he no longer possessed. Brandon let out a horrifying, guttural gasp. He stammered frantically, pleading with me not to do this, swearing that he would divorce Megan today and move back home to take care of Valerie. He cried that this company was his entire life and losing it would instantly force him into severe personal bankruptcy. I replied that he should have considered the devastating consequences of his actions before he chose to sacrifice his loyal family for the fleeting illusion of elite social status. I told him that he was now completely untethered from my protection. I advised him to step out of that cheap motel bathroom and deliver the glorious news to his demanding bride. With that final instruction, I permanently disconnected the call and blocked his number from my private network. Back at the motel, Brandon dropped his phone onto the cracked bathroom tile, staring blankly at the wall as his entire universe collapsed into absolute dust. Outside the bathroom door, Megan began aggressively pounding on the thin wood, screaming at him to hurry up and secure the money for her luxury mansion. She had no idea that she was currently screaming at a man who was now millions of dollars in debt and facing a federal criminal investigation. The ultimate tragedy of their toxic marriage was just beginning to unfold, and they were entirely trapped together in this exact same hell. The morning after the disastrous wedding, Thomas found himself completely trapped in a nightmare of his own making. For years, he had successfully masqueraded as a wealthy aristocratic patriarch floating through high society country clubs on a cloud of dangerous debt. He had borrowed heavily from ruthless underground loan sharks to maintain the grand illusion of old money to buy expensive tailored suits and to fund his daughter's lavish lifestyle. He firmly believed that Megan's marriage to a brilliant tech executive would finally provide the ultimate financial bailout he desperately needed to clear his dangerous ledgers. But my public revelation at the estate had completely shattered his protective shield. The moment the local gossip blogs published the humiliating details of the canceled wedding, the dangerous men who held his massive debts immediately called his personal cell phone. They were no longer willing to wait for polite monthly payments. They demanded an immediate bulk settlement of $200,000 in pure cash by sundown, or they promised to start breaking bones. Terrified and out of options, Thomas aggressively tracked Brandon down to the cheap roadside motel. He kicked the thin wooden door open with his heavy leather boot, startling both Brandon and his daughter. Thomas did not care about their current marital arguments or their ruined honeymoon. He grabbed his new son-in-law by the collar of his wrinkled shirt and violently slammed him against the stained wallpaper. His breath reeked of cheap whiskey and sheer panic. He screamed that Brandon had ruined his entire life and demanded immediate financial compensation. Thomas pulled a crumpled legal document from his jacket pocket and shoved a pen into Brandon's trembling hand. He commanded Brandon to officially sign over 50% of his tech startup shares directly to him right this second. Thomas yelled that since the wedding was a complete financial disaster, these valuable corporate shares were the only acceptable form of repayment he would take to keep the loan sharks from destroying his legs. Brandon stared at the aggressive older man, completely cornered and rapidly running out of breathable oxygen in the tiny motel room. Brandon coughed violently as Thomas finally released his tight grip on his wrinkled collar, letting him slide down the stained motel wall. He rubbed his sore neck and stared at the crumpled transfer document resting on the cheap laminate floor. Normally, Brandon would have fought back with his usual arrogant corporate posturing, refusing to hand over even a single fraction of his beloved company. But his current reality was rapidly spiraling into an inescapable nightmare of federal proportions. Just 1 hour prior, he had received a terrifying automated alert from the federal banking system, notifying him that he was under active criminal investigation for the attempted theft of my retirement funds. He knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that my brilliant attorney Jonathan was already drafting a merciless lawsuit that would easily put him behind bars for decades. He desperately needed to hire a top-tier criminal defense lawyer immediately to avoid federal prison. Good lawyers demanded massive upfront retainer fees in pure cash, and Brandon was completely locked out of every legitimate financial institution in the city. He looked up at Thomas, who was pacing the small room like a rabid dog, sweating profusely and cursing under his breath. An incredibly desperate and foolish idea quickly formed in Brandon's panicked mind. He realized that if he willingly signed over half of his startup shares to his father-in-law, he could demand an immediate cash payment in return. He needed a fast, unrecorded injection of capital, and Thomas was offering a quick transaction. Brandon slowly picked up the pen from the floor and carefully smoothed out the crumpled legal paper. He looked Thomas directly in the eyes and stated his strict conditions. He agreed to authorize the transfer of exactly 50% of his corporate stock, but only if Thomas handed over $10,000 in physical cash by noon today to secure his legal defense fund. Thomas laughed bitterly at the pathetic request, but he was far too desperate to argue the minor details. He mistakenly believed those shares were still worth millions of dollars and would easily satisfy the violent men hunting him down. Thomas eagerly nodded in agreement, making a completely empty promise to deliver the cash later that afternoon. Brandon hastily scrawled his signature across the bottom of the legal document, legally transferring ownership of the stock. He handed the paper back, feeling a brief, false sense of relief washing over his tired body. He truly believed he had just successfully outsmarted both me and the federal government. He was so consumed by arrogance that he completely forgot the devastating call we shared about his zero-value business stock, which was now practically worthless. Thomas practically sprinted out of the motel room, clutching the freshly signed transfer document against his chest like a winning lottery ticket. He climbed into the driver's seat of his leased luxury sedan and sped off toward the gritty industrial district on the far south side of the city. He parked his expensive car near an abandoned warehouse, stepping out into the dim afternoon light with a confident swagger that he had not possessed all day. He honestly believed he was about to outsmart the most dangerous underground loan sharks in the entire state by handing them 50% of a booming software enterprise. He walked straight into the cold, shadowy building where three massive, intimidating men were waiting for him beside a rusty metal desk. The lead enforcer, a heavily scarred man named Victor, did not even bother to stand up when Thomas approached. Victor simply held out a large, calloused hand, expecting the thick envelope of physical cash they had explicitly demanded. Instead, Thomas proudly slammed the folded legal document directly onto the metal surface. He puffed out his chest and delivered an arrogant, rehearsed speech declaring that this piece of paper was worth 10 times the amount of money he owed them. He confidently explained that it represented half ownership of his genius son-in-law's lucrative technology startup. Victor slowly picked up the paper, his dark eyes scanning the hasty signature at the bottom. He did not look impressed. He calmly handed the document to a much younger associate standing behind him holding an encrypted tablet device. The young associate spent exactly 2 minutes typing the official corporate registry number into a financial database to verify the company's current market valuation. The resulting silence in the warehouse was absolutely terrifying. The associate looked up from the glowing screen and whispered something quietly into Victor's ear. He informed his boss that the entire seed funding for this particular startup had been aggressively legally withdrawn by its primary angel investor just hours ago. He confirmed that the corporate banking accounts were completely drained, currently sitting at zero balances, and the stock Thomas just handed them was entirely worthless. It was essentially nothing more than expensive toilet paper. Victor's expression darkened into a mask of menacing rage. He slowly stood up from his chair, the metal legs scraping loudly against the concrete floor. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face as the crushing reality of Brandon's deception finally hit him. He tried to take a step back, raising his trembling hands to apologize, but it was far too late for excuses. Victor signaled his men to lock the heavy warehouse doors. The massive steel barriers rolled shut, plunging the room into darkness. The ruthless mob turned their violent attention directly onto Thomas, completely ready to extract their payment the hard way. Back at the cheap roadside motel, Megan was entirely unaware that her arrogant father was currently fighting for his life in a dark, locked industrial warehouse. She sat cross-legged on the heavily stained mattress, furiously tapping the screen of her expensive smartphone. Her pristine bridal image had been completely shattered, and she desperately needed to reclaim the narrative before the society blogs officially ruined her reputation. She opened her primary social media account and began uploading a series of heavily edited video clips from the ruined wedding reception. She purposefully manipulated the footage, slicing the timeline to completely remove the horrifying moment where she violently shoved my disabled wife into the mud. Instead, she posted a tightly cropped video showing only the chaotic aftermath. The edited clip showed Valerie already sitting in the dirt looking disheveled while I stormed up to the stage with a severe expression on my face. Megan added a tearful audio voiceover claiming that her aggressive and unpredictable father-in-law had suddenly snapped and ruined the happiest day of her life in a fit of violent rage. She completely fabricated a pathetic story insisting that Valerie had drunkenly tripped and ruined her expensive designer gown, and that I had retaliated by ruthlessly evicting everyone from the property. She tagged several major celebrity gossip pages and typed out a long, dramatic caption begging for public sympathy and donations to help her recover from the severe emotional trauma we had supposedly inflicted upon her. Within a matter of hours, the manipulated video went completely viral. Thousands of angry strangers began flooding the comment sections with hateful messages directed at my wife and me. They ruthlessly called us abusive monsters, incredibly toxic parents, and an absolutely violent societal disgrace. Megan's follower count skyrocketed as she continued to play the ultimate devastated victim, live streaming her fake tears from the dingy motel room. She genuinely believed she had successfully weaponized the entire internet against us, utilizing the angry digital mob to completely destroy our public standing forever, while simultaneously hiding her own deeply despicable and highly violent actions from the entire outside world. As the hateful comments and vile threats began to multiply exponentially across various social media platforms, my own cell phone started buzzing relentlessly. Well-meaning friends and former business associates were calling to warn me about the rapidly spreading viral scandal. They urged me to release a public statement to defend my character or hire a crisis management team to combat the aggressive online defamation campaign Megan had launched against my family. I did absolutely none of those things. I poured myself a fresh cup of tea, sat down in my quiet study, and completely ignored the internet trolls. Decades of corporate maneuvering had taught me one undeniable truth. Never interrupt an enemy when they are actively digging their own grave. Megan's entire strategy relied heavily on the false assumption that there were no independent witnesses to her violent behavior in the garden. She mistakenly believed that because her affluent guests were too shocked to record the initial physical assault, the evidence simply did not exist. She was incredibly foolish to assume I would ever leave the security of my multi-million-dollar historic property up to chance. 3 years ago, when I originally purchased the sprawling estate, I ordered a comprehensive security overhaul. I had my contractors discreetly install military-grade, high-definition 4,000-pixel security cameras across every single inch of the property. Those cameras were perfectly concealed within the ornate exterior lighting fixtures, the stone statues, and the ancient oak trees. They continuously recorded panoramic audio and pristine video footage of the entire grounds directly to an encrypted private server. Megan did not realize she had just assaulted the owner of the estate directly underneath a hidden camera lens. I picked up my phone and made a brief calm call to my lawyer, Jonathan. I did not sound worried or panicked. I simply gave him a direct and precise command. I instructed Jonathan to remotely access the private server and extract the unedited raw footage from the garden camera covering the exact timestamp of the incident. I told him to bypass the completely useless social media platforms entirely and prepare a highly direct legal submission that would immediately end her little game once and for all. The public court of opinion is always incredibly fickle and easily swayed by lies, but undeniable physical video evidence remains an absolute force of unshakable reality. Megan wanted to play a dangerous game of digital warfare, relying on edited clips and fake tears to ruin my reputation. I was about to retaliate with the unvarnished, brutal truth. I instructed Jonathan to package the high-resolution video file alongside a formal police complaint for felony assault against a vulnerable senior citizen. Jonathan executed my firm orders with absolute brutal efficiency. He did not bother creating a new social media profile to argue with strangers in the comment section. Instead, he utilized his high-level media connections to deliver the encrypted video file directly to the lead investigative journalists at 3 major national news networks. He also submitted the footage to the local police department, commanding an immediate criminal review of the unprovoked assault. At 6:00 that evening, while Megan was still busily live-streaming from her motel bed, begging her followers for financial donations, the national evening news broadcasts simultaneously aired the unedited security footage. The pristine 4,000-pixel resolution left absolutely no room for misinterpretation or doubt. Millions of viewers across the entire country watched in sheer horror as Megan intentionally stepped toward Valerie, planted both hands firmly on her fragile shoulders, and violently shoved the disabled elderly woman backward into the thick mud. The clear panoramic audio captured the sickening thud of Valerie's fall, followed by Brandon's mocking laughter. The footage instantly exposed Megan's carefully crafted victim narrative as a malicious, calculated lie. The public backlash was immediate and absolutely catastrophic. The very same internet mob that had been fiercely defending her just hours prior turned on her with terrifying speed and ferocious anger. Her comment sections were rapidly flooded with millions of furious messages demanding justice for my wife. The major celebrity gossip pages that had previously shared her entirely fake sob story immediately issued massive public retractions, actively condemning her horrific behavior and apologizing to my family for spreading such dangerous misinformation without ever verifying the core facts. Several highly prominent social media influencers who had generously donated significant amounts of money to her newly created fake online charity fund announced angrily that they were actively filing severe federal wire fraud charges against her to ensure she faced the maximum possible penalty under the law. Megan's follower count plummeted by the hundreds of thousands every single minute. The digital empire she thought she had conquered collapsed, completely burying her underneath an avalanche of public hatred. She sat frozen on the stained motel mattress, watching the live news broadcast, her mouth hanging wide open in pure disbelief as her phone screen flashed endlessly with notifications of intense public outrage. She had arrogantly tried to completely destroy my wonderful family using the very dangerous, unchecked power of the internet, but she ultimately handed the entire watching world the exact, undeniable physical proof needed to rightfully destroy her own shallow, pathetic life instead. The brutal court of public opinion had just delivered its final devastating verdict, and there was absolutely no possibility of an appeal. Meanwhile, the local police department, having just thoroughly reviewed the crystal-clear, unedited security footage, officially issued an active felony warrant for her immediate physical arrest. Inside the suffocating confines of the cheap roadside motel room, Megan remained completely oblivious to the massive national news broadcast that had just effectively ended her entire social life. She sat cross-legged on the heavily stained mattress, balancing her expensive smartphone against a cheap plastic water bottle to maintain the perfect camera angle. She had applied fresh makeup specifically designed to make her look pale, exhausted, and thoroughly victimized. She pressed the live button on her primary social media account and immediately launched into a spectacular theatrical performance. She forced large crocodile tears to stream down her cheeks, staring directly into the camera lens as she begged her remaining followers for immediate financial assistance. She loudly announced that she had just launched a massive online crowdfunding campaign asking for $100,000 to help her and her husband escape the terrifying grasp of her wealthy but incredibly abusive in-laws. She stared into the camera and painted a horrifyingly fake picture of my wife and me. She claimed that we had intentionally trapped them in absolute poverty, freezing their bank accounts out of pure malicious spite and leaving them completely stranded on the side of the road on their wedding night. She sobbed dramatically, telling her audience that she legitimately feared for her physical safety and urgently needed donations to hire a protective legal team. She was so entirely absorbed in reading the incoming comments and watching her donation counter slowly tick upward that she did not even notice the flashing red and blue police lights illuminating the thin motel curtains. The live stream was just reaching its absolute emotional peak when 3 incredibly loud, heavy knocks suddenly rattled the flimsy wooden door. The aggressive pounding was so forceful that the cheap plastic frame of the motel mirror violently rattled against the drywall. Megan jumped in surprise, dropping her perfectly rehearsed victim persona for a fraction of a second. She turned her head toward the door, an expression of extreme annoyance crossing her face as she yelled for whoever was outside to simply go away. The heavy pounding immediately returned, followed by a deep, authoritative voice demanding entry. Megan barely had time to slide off the stained mattress before the flimsy wooden door was violently kicked open from the outside. The cheap deadbolt splintered instantly, sending chunks of cheap wood flying across the stained carpet. 4 fully armed city police officers stormed into the tiny motel room, their heavy black boots stomping loudly against the floorboards. The lead officer, a tall, imposing woman with a stern expression, stepped directly into the center of the room and immediately identified herself. Megan shrieked in absolute terror, frantically scrambling backward until her back hit the peeling wallpaper. She demanded to know what they were doing, screaming that they had no right to break into her private room. She wildly pointed at her smartphone, which was still actively broadcasting the entire chaotic scene to thousands of shocked viewers, and threatened to sue the entire police department for brutal harassment. The lead officer completely ignored her shrill threats. She unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from her tactical belt and marched straight toward the terrified bride. The officer grabbed Megan's arm, twisting it firmly but professionally behind her back, and loudly ordered her to stop resisting. The distinct metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut echoed sharply in the small room. The officer looked Megan directly in the eyes and officially read her the Miranda rights in a cold, completely detached voice. She informed Megan that she was being placed under immediate physical arrest for 2 highly serious felony charges. The first charge was the aggravated physical assault of a vulnerable disabled senior citizen, directly referencing the crystal-clear 4,000-pixel security footage that had just been broadcast across the entire nation. The second devastating charge was grand financial fraud and the deliberate forgery of commercial documents. The officer explicitly detailed how Megan had intentionally manufactured completely fake vendor invoices to illegally extract $50,000 from her own father, completely defrauding him under false pretenses. Megan gasped for air, her eyes darting frantically around the room as the undeniable reality of her multiple severe crimes finally caught up to her. She began violently thrashing her shoulders, crying hysterically and screaming that it was all a giant misunderstanding. She begged the officers to check her phone, insisting that she was the real victim in this situation. The lead officer simply shook her head in total disgust, tightening her grip on Megan's handcuffed wrists and forcefully marching her toward the shattered motel door. The entire arrest played out live on her own social media broadcast, providing the ultimate undisputed proof of her absolute downfall to the exact same internet audience she had just tried to exploit for money. Brandon had been hiding inside the cramped motel bathroom when the police initially breached the front door. He slowly stepped out into the main room, his face completely drained of color as he watched his new bride being roughly dragged toward the police cruiser waiting outside in the dark parking lot. Megan desperately dug the heels of her expensive shoes into the cheap carpet, fighting the officers with everything she had. She twisted her neck to look back at Brandon, her makeup completely ruined by her frantic tears. She screamed his name at the top of her lungs, begging him to immediately call a lawyer and pay whatever bail the police demanded. She yelled that they needed to stick together and fight these ridiculous false charges as a united front. She ordered him to use his massive tech startup funds to get her out of the county jail tonight. Brandon just stood there completely frozen in place, staring at the flashing red and blue lights illuminating his ruined life. He knew the absolute horrifying truth that she still refused to accept. His massive tech startup was entirely gone, drained to zero by my corporate withdrawal. His personal banking accounts were entirely frozen pending a massive federal criminal investigation for elder financial abuse. He did not even have enough physical cash in his wallet to buy a cheap dinner, let alone post a massive felony bail bond. But more importantly, Brandon was an incredibly selfish coward who only cared about his own personal survival. He looked at the furious police officers and then looked down at his screaming, handcuffed wife. He realized in that exact moment that associating with her violent, highly publicized crimes would only make his impending federal embezzlement case significantly worse. He made a rapid, completely ruthless calculation to save his own skin. Brandon took a slow, deliberate step backward, raising his hands defensively in the air, and shook his head. He looked directly at the arresting officers and loudly declared that he had absolutely nothing to do with her illegal activities. He explicitly stated that he was entirely unaware of her violent assault against his mother and completely ignorant of the financial fraud she committed against her own father. He threw his new bride completely under the bus without a single ounce of hesitation. Megan stopped struggling instantly. Her mouth dropped open in pure, unadulterated shock as the ultimate betrayal registered in her mind. The man she had married strictly for his wealth and status was completely abandoning her to rot in a jail cell. She unleashed a horrifying, guttural scream, cursing his name and wishing him absolute death as the officers finally shoved her into the back of the dark police cruiser and slammed the heavy metal door shut. As the police car sped away into the night, their incredibly toxic marriage officially shattered into a million irreparable pieces, leaving Brandon completely alone in a broken motel room, waiting for the federal agents to inevitably come for him next. The cold reality of total isolation finally shattered Brandon's immense arrogance as he stood alone in the empty motel room, watching the taillights of the police cruiser disappear into the night. He had no money, no credit, and no company left to his name. With federal investigators actively breathing down his neck, he knew he only had one desperate option left to avoid a lengthy prison sentence. He needed my protection and my bottomless bank account. He managed to scrape together just enough loose change from the bottom of his ruined tuxedo pockets to catch a late-night bus back to my old suburban neighborhood. The rain had started to fall in heavy freezing sheets by the time he finally dragged himself up my front steps. He pounded his fist frantically against my heavy oak front door, completely ignoring the late hour. When I finally opened the door, Brandon collapsed onto the wet wooden porch, instantly dropping to both of his knees. He looked absolutely pathetic. His expensive designer suit was completely soaked with dirty rainwater, and his face was twisted in an expression of pure desperation. He immediately started sobbing loudly, grabbing the hem of my bathrobe and unleashing a torrent of rapid, pathetic excuses. He aggressively blamed Megan for absolutely everything. He swore that she was the one who forced him to act so cruelly, claiming she had manipulated his mind and poisoned him against his own family. He cried that she had orchestrated the entire wedding disaster and forced him to pull those corporate funds against his will. He begged me to forgive his temporary insanity and desperately pleaded for me to immediately restore his authorized access to the massive family trust fund. He promised to divorce her tomorrow morning, check himself into a rehabilitation clinic, and spend the rest of his entire life making up for the horrible pain he had caused us. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, waiting for the familiar, comforting warmth of a father's unconditional forgiveness to simply wash away all of his massive, self-inflicted problems right now in this dark, freezing storm. I stood perfectly still in the open doorway, letting the freezing rain blow onto my slippers as I looked down at the miserable man kneeling on my porch. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for him. The time for warm, fatherly comfort had permanently expired the exact moment he watched his bride violently assault his disabled mother and chose to laugh. I reached down, forcefully grabbed his soaked collar, and rapidly pulled him up from the wet wooden floorboards. I did not say a word of comfort. I simply turned my back to the storm and walked silently into the dimly lit hallway, leaving the heavy front door wide open for him to follow. Brandon stumbled inside, shivering violently and dripping dirty rainwater onto the hardwood floor. He closed the door behind him, letting out a long, shaky breath, thinking he had finally secured his ultimate rescue. He followed me nervously into the formal dining room where the soft ambient glow of a small reading lamp illuminated the long mahogany table. Valerie was already asleep upstairs, completely shielded from this final ugly confrontation. I pointed firmly toward a solid wooden chair positioned directly opposite my usual seat at the table. Brandon practically collapsed into the chair, rubbing his freezing hands together and staring at me with a pathetic glimmer of newfound hope shining in his tired eyes. He opened his mouth, preparing to launch into another long, rehearsed speech about his terrible marital regrets. I silenced him instantly by raising a single flat hand in the air. I reached into my leather briefcase resting on the nearby floor and slowly pulled out a very thick, heavy red folder. The bright crimson color of the thick paper stood out sharply against the dark, polished wood of the dining table. I placed my right hand firmly on top of the sealed document and looked directly into his eyes. My expression was completely blank, entirely devoid of the familiar parental warmth he desperately craved. I slid the thick red folder slowly across the smooth table surface until it came to a complete stop directly in front of his trembling hands. The sharp scraping sound of the heavy paper sliding against the polished mahogany echoed loudly in the quiet house. Brandon stared down at the bright red cover, completely confused by my bizarrely calm demeanor. He hesitated for a long, tense moment before his nervous fingers finally reached out to flip open the heavy protective cover, completely unaware of the absolute devastation resting inside those bound, glossy pages, waiting to completely end his miserable life and permanently strip away the very last shred of his incredibly arrogant pride right now tonight. The first page inside the folder was a crisp color copy of a massive commercial real estate loan document. Brandon's eyes darted across the bold black lettering at the very top of the page. It was a formal deed of trust, linked directly to a large plot of prime agricultural land located just outside the city limits. That specific property was not just any random piece of dirt. It was my beautiful wife Valerie's sacred ancestral land passed down through her family for 4 incredible generations. She cherished that land more than anything else in the world and explicitly intended to preserve it forever. But as Brandon continued reading the dense legal paragraphs, his breathing suddenly stopped. He saw his own messy signature scrawled across the bottom line right next to a perfect exact replica of Valerie's delicate cursive handwriting. 2 years ago, when he was desperately trying to launch his doomed software company, he secretly needed collateral to secure a massive hidden bridge loan. He thought Valerie was too sick and distracted by her multiple sclerosis treatments to ever notice missing paperwork. He had carefully practiced tracing her signature for weeks until he could perfectly forge it onto the binding legal documents. He illegally mortgaged her beloved family land to secure quick cash for his failing business completely without her knowledge or consent. He thought he had successfully buried the dangerous secret forever. He looked up at me, the remaining color completely draining from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked entirely, unable to form a single coherent word of defense. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany table, and delivered the final crushing blow in a cold, quiet whisper. I informed him that my attorney Jonathan had officially ordered a comprehensive forensic audit of the family estate early yesterday morning. The highly trained forensic handwriting experts easily identified the blatant forgery. The bank holding the fraudulent mortgage had already been formally notified, and they were absolutely furious. I explained that the initial federal charges for elder financial abuse and wire fraud were merely the opening act of his total destruction. By deliberately falsifying a secured commercial mortgage on a multi-million-dollar property, he had officially committed federal bank fraud and aggravated identity theft. These incredibly severe charges carried mandatory minimum prison sentences that no expensive lawyer could ever negotiate away. I coldly told him that the red folder currently resting in his trembling hands was an exact duplicate of the heavy evidence file Jonathan had already delivered to the federal prosecutor's office. Brandon dropped the file as if it were burning his flesh completely, realizing that his life was irrevocably over. He had walked into my home expecting a financial rescue, but instead he received his final inescapable doom. Brandon fled my house that night, running blindly back into the freezing rain after dropping the red folder of damning evidence onto my dining room floor. He knew he was completely trapped and that the federal authorities would be actively hunting him down within a matter of hours. The severe forgery charges carried mandatory minimum sentences, and his entire life was effectively over if he remained inside the country. He managed to secure a cheap prepaid burner phone using the last few dollars in his pocket and spent the entire night hiding in a filthy, abandoned bus station, actively plotting his final desperate escape. By the time the morning sun began to rise, he had formulated a highly illegal exit strategy. His software company was completely bankrupt and his bank accounts were entirely frozen, but he still possessed the primary source code for the proprietary artificial intelligence algorithm he had been loudly bragging about for the past 2 years. He immediately contacted the chief executive officer of a highly aggressive rival technology firm, offering to secretly sell them the entire unencrypted source code for $1 million in pure, untraceable cryptocurrency. He promised them exclusive, immediate access to the revolutionary software architecture if they agreed to finalize the transaction by noon today. He planned to use that massive influx of digital cash to illegally purchase a forged foreign passport and permanently flee the country before the federal prosecutors could officially issue his arrest warrant. The rival executive, incredibly eager to acquire such highly advanced technology for a mere fraction of its actual market value, eagerly agreed to the illicit backroom deal. They arranged an emergency physical meeting at an upscale corporate coffee shop located right in the middle of the bustling downtown financial district. Brandon arrived at the designated location looking absolutely terrible, his clothes still damp from the storm, his eyes bloodshot and his hands trembling violently. He sat down across from the wealthy rival executive, completely ready to finalize the treacherous deal and permanently abandon his entire ruined life, leaving everything and everyone he had completely destroyed behind him forever, without any regrets. Brandon pulled a sleek, silver digital storage drive from his jacket pocket and placed it carefully onto the polished wooden table. The rival executive smiled greedily and pulled a thick, legally binding non-disclosure agreement and an official transfer contract from his leather briefcase, sliding them across the table alongside an expensive metal pen. Brandon picked up the pen, his heart pounding rapidly in his chest, incredibly relieved that his final escape plan was actually working flawlessly. He pressed the tip of the pen against the signature line, ready to officially authorize the illegal transfer of the proprietary software code. Before the ink could even touch the thick paper, a large hand suddenly clamped down forcefully over Brandon's wrist, completely stopping his movement. Brandon gasped in shock, looking up to see Jonathan standing directly over him, wearing an immaculate tailored suit and a perfectly calm professional expression. 3 other corporate lawyers immediately swarmed the small table, physically blocking any possible exit routes while simultaneously confiscating the silver storage drive and the thick transfer contracts. The rival executive jumped up from his chair, shouting angrily and demanding to know the meaning of this blatant disruption. Jonathan did not raise his voice or show any emotion. He simply pulled a massive stack of officially stamped court documents from his own briefcase and dropped them heavily onto the table. Jonathan calmly informed the angry executive that the transaction was permanently halted by a federal court injunction signed by a federal judge exactly 20 minutes ago. The rival executive stared at the official legal seals, his confident demeanor instantly vanishing into thin air. Jonathan looked directly at Brandon and delivered the ultimate devastating revelation that I had patiently waited 2 entire years to expose. Jonathan clearly explained that the incredibly advanced software code Brandon was desperately trying to sell did not actually belong to him. Brandon had always claimed he was a brilliant visionary who wrote the revolutionary artificial intelligence algorithm entirely from scratch in his own apartment. That was an absolute lie. He was never a genius developer. Jonathan revealed that the entire core source code was actually directly stolen from a secure private server belonging to a highly successful international tech subsidiary. Jonathan paused, letting the heavy silence stretch before delivering the final crushing blow to Brandon's inflated ego. He coldly informed the entire table that I was the primary majority shareholder and active chairman of that exact tech subsidiary. Brandon had literally stolen the proprietary code directly from his own father's massive corporate empire, completely unaware that I had secretly embedded tracking software into every single line of the stolen algorithm, just waiting for him to finally attempt a highly illegal sale. The rival tech executive instantly recognized the massive, devastating legal trap he had almost willingly stepped into. He grabbed his expensive leather briefcase and rapidly sprinted out of the busy corporate coffee shop, completely abandoning Brandon without a single word of hesitation. Brandon sat frozen in his chair, his eyes wide with absolute horror as the complete reality of his massive intellectual property theft finally settled over him. Jonathan calmly picked up the thick stack of federal court documents and formally served them directly into Brandon's trembling hands. Jonathan coldly explained the exact details of the final crushing blow. Brandon was now being officially slapped with a massive $10 million federal lawsuit for the malicious theft and attempted illegal distribution of highly proprietary corporate technology. Furthermore, because Brandon was actively attempting to finalize a fraudulent cash transaction specifically intended to facilitate an illegal flight from active criminal prosecution, the presiding federal judge had immediately granted a total and complete asset freeze. Every single remaining cent linked to his name was completely locked by the highest legal authorities. Any secret offshore accounts, hidden shell companies, or cryptocurrency wallets he still possessed were entirely seized pending a comprehensive international federal investigation. His absolute financial ruin was now permanently secured by the rigid power of the federal court system. Jonathan then pulled one final document from his pristine suit jacket. It was an official federal order to immediately surrender all travel documents. Jonathan instructed one of his massive corporate security guards to physically retrieve Brandon's passport directly from his damp jacket pocket. The large guard stepped forward quickly, reaching into the ruined suit and pulling out the small blue booklet Brandon had desperately planned to use for his cowardly escape. Brandon did not even attempt to resist or fight back. He simply slouched forward in the wooden coffee shop chair, completely defeated, entirely broken, and absolutely trapped. He had no money left to purchase a cheap meal, no hidden funds to hire a defense attorney, and absolutely zero legal ability to leave the immediate jurisdiction. His arrogant plan to simply run away from the massive consequences of his terrible actions had spectacularly exploded directly in his face, leaving him completely exposed to the incoming wrath of the federal justice system. Jonathan placed the confiscated passport securely into his own briefcase, gave Brandon one final look of absolute utter disgust, and calmly walked out of the coffee shop with his entire legal team closely following behind him. Brandon was left sitting entirely alone in the crowded cafe, completely surrounded by normal people living their normal lives, while his own arrogant existence entirely disintegrated into absolute nothingness, guaranteeing that his inevitable imprisonment was now only a matter of days, leaving him waiting in absolute pure terror for the local police to arrive and lock him away forever. Brandon somehow managed to drag his heavy feet back to the cheap roadside motel room hours after his disastrous encounter at the coffee shop. He had absolutely nowhere else to go. His passport was gone, his bank accounts were entirely frozen, and his massive technology company was a complete illusion. He pushed open the flimsy wooden door and collapsed onto the stained mattress, staring blankly at the ceiling. The heavy silence of the room was suddenly shattered by the sound of screeching tires in the parking lot, followed immediately by heavy, frantic footsteps echoing on the exterior walkway. Before Brandon could even sit up, the motel room door was violently kicked open for the second time in 24 hours. Thomas stood in the doorway, breathing heavily and looking absolutely horrific. His expensive designer suit was torn into dirty shreds, and his face was covered in dark purple bruises and dried blood. The underground loan sharks at the warehouse had clearly delivered a brutal physical message before giving him a final, impossible deadline. Thomas stepped into the room, his eyes wild with the frantic, terrified energy of a cornered animal. He looked at Brandon lying on the bed and let out a guttural scream of pure, agonizing rage. He realized that the transfer documents Brandon had given him were entirely worthless and had only accelerated his impending death sentence. Thomas lunged across the small room, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his aristocratic dignity. He grabbed Brandon by the throat with both of his trembling hands, lifting him slightly off the stained mattress and slamming his head back against the cheap wooden headboard. Thomas spat blood onto the floor, screaming that Brandon had intentionally handed him over to the mob to be slaughtered. He demanded his money, demanding a way out, threatening to snap Brandon's neck right then and there if he did not instantly produce the physical cash he had promised just hours ago. The desperate older man dug his fingers deeply into Brandon's windpipe, choking the absolute life out of the arrogant tech executive who had just completely ruined his entire family permanently. Brandon was not going to simply lie there and accept a violent death from his disgraced father-in-law. He had already lost his massive company, his wealthy wife, and his entire future, so the remaining sliver of his completely shattered ego finally snapped into pure animalistic survival mode. He reached up and clawed viciously at Thomas' face, digging his fingernails into the fresh bruises and tearing at the older man's bloodshot eyes. Thomas howled in sudden pain, loosening his tight grip just enough for Brandon to aggressively shove his knees upward. Brandon kicked Thomas squarely in the chest, sending the older man stumbling backward across the cheap laminate flooring. Thomas crashed heavily into a small wooden desk, sending a cheap plastic lamp shattering against the motel wall. The room instantly devolved into a chaotic, brutal brawl between two incredibly desperate and entirely broken men. Brandon scrambled off the stained mattress, throwing a heavy, wild punch that connected solidly with Thomas' jaw. They grappled fiercely, rolling across the dirty carpet, knocking over the flimsy television stand and smashing the screen into dozens of jagged glass pieces. Neither man noticed the bright, flashing red and blue lights suddenly illuminating the thin curtains. They were too busy destroying each other to realize that Jonathan had actively deployed his elite private investigators to closely monitor their erratic movements all afternoon. The private investigators had seamlessly tracked Thomas from the dangerous industrial warehouse directly back to the roadside motel and immediately tipped off the local police department about an active, violent altercation currently in progress. While Brandon and Thomas were busy tearing each other's clothes and exchanging brutal punches, the motel room door was violently kicked open for the third and final time. 6 uniformed city police officers rushed into the cramped space, screaming loud, authoritative commands to immediately cease fighting. The officers did not hesitate to use physical force against the 2 bleeding men. They aggressively pulled Brandon off Thomas, slamming him face first into the stained mattress and forcefully twisting his arms behind his back. The distinct sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed over the chaotic shouting. Another pair of officers tackled Thomas roughly to the carpet, pressing their knees firmly into his aching spine. Both men were officially read their legal rights and placed under immediate physical arrest for severe assault and battery. The officers completely ignored their frantic, breathless excuses, aggressively dragging both bleeding suspects out of the destroyed motel room and shoving them roughly into the back of 2 separate waiting police cruisers, completely sealing their inevitable fate under the bright glow of the streetlights, effectively terminating their remaining freedom as the doors heavily slammed shut forever. The cold, sterile environment of the downtown police precinct interrogation room provided a harsh contrast to the chaotic motel brawl. Thomas sat slumped in a metal chair, shivering uncontrollably under the bright fluorescent lights. His hands were securely cuffed to the solid steel table bolted to the floor in front of him. A police medic had hastily bandaged his bleeding forehead, but no amount of gauze could stop the overwhelming terror pulsing through his veins. He was not just afraid of the severe assault charges, he was absolutely terrified of the ruthless mob enforcers currently hunting him down. He knew with absolute certainty that if the police released him on standard bail, the loan sharks would easily find him and brutally murder him before sunset. Thomas desperately needed immediate federal protection, and he knew exactly how to buy his guaranteed safety. When the lead detective finally entered the small room holding a thick manila folder, Thomas did not ask for a defense attorney. He immediately begged for a binding plea deal. The older man leaned across the steel table, his voice shaking wildly as he offered to completely turn state's evidence against his own son-in-law. He frantically promised to deliver a massive goldmine of illicit corporate information if the police agreed to place him into a highly secure protective custody program. The detective raised a skeptical eyebrow, but calmly opened his notepad, entirely willing to listen. Thomas took a deep, ragged breath and aggressively threw Brandon entirely under the speeding bus. He began spilling absolutely every single detail regarding Brandon's massive corporate money laundering schemes. He explicitly described how Brandon had systematically funneled millions of dollars through completely fake shell companies to artificially inflate the apparent value of his tech startup. Thomas provided precise dates, exact locations, and the specific names of corrupt offshore bankers Brandon had secretly utilized to hide his stolen assets. He even confessed his own minor role in distributing some of the dirty funds, eagerly sacrificing his own limited reputation just to guarantee Brandon's absolute destruction. The detective wrote furiously, filling page after page with the incredibly damning financial evidence. Thomas detailed exactly how Brandon had attempted to illegally mortgage Valerie's ancestral land, fully corroborating the massive evidence file Jonathan had already submitted to the federal prosecutors. He exposed the fake invoices Megan had created, revealing that Brandon was fully aware of the wedding fraud from the very beginning. By the time the exhausted detective finally closed his thick notepad, Thomas had essentially handed the authorities a perfectly wrapped federal indictment. His terrifying desperation had successfully completely shattered the absolute last remaining pillar of Brandon's pathetic life. Thomas secured his temporary safety, but in doing so, he expertly tightened the legal noose permanently around his own son's neck, ensuring they would both face the absolute final ruin. The cold concrete walls of the dark county jail cell provided a stark contrast to the very luxurious lifestyle Megan had demanded just a few hours prior. She spent the entire night shivering under a thin, scratchy blanket surrounded by the harsh reality of her incredibly violent crimes. When the morning guard finally permitted her to use the communal telephone, she did not call a professional defense attorney or reach out to her battered father. She knew her family was completely bankrupt and utterly useless. Instead, she dialed a private number she had secretly memorized years ago. The number belonged to an older, incredibly wealthy former boyfriend named Richard, who had always maintained a dangerous, lingering obsession with her. She played the vulnerable, traumatized victim flawlessly, over the brief, unrecorded phone call, sobbing heavily and claiming she had been severely abused and framed by a psychotic tech executive. Richard eagerly swallowed every single lie. Within 2 hours, a high-priced bail bondsman arrived at the precinct carrying a massive certified cashier check to secure her immediate physical release. Megan walked out of the heavy sliding steel doors, trading her orange jumpsuit for her ruined, muddy wedding dress with a renewed sense of vicious determination. She did not go into hiding or attempt to apologize to the public. She went straight to the sleek glass offices of the most aggressive divorce attorney in the city. She sat across from the ruthless lawyer and immediately launched a massive preemptive legal strike against the man who had abandoned her to the police. Megan formally filed an enormous civil lawsuit against Brandon, citing severe marital fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and complete financial deception. She aggressively demanded permanent, exorbitant spousal support, claiming Brandon had maliciously lied about his vast personal wealth and his fake corporate status simply to trap her in a fraudulent marriage. She wanted to bleed him completely dry, entirely unaware that the massive financial well she was desperately trying to tap into had already been permanently cemented shut by my elite legal team, leaving absolutely nothing left for her to ever steal again. Meanwhile, across town, in a completely different and far less accommodating holding cell, Brandon was experiencing the absolute lowest moment of his entire miserable existence. His designer suit was torn to shreds and covered in dried blood from the violent brawl with his furious father-in-law. His entire body ached immensely, and his left eye was swollen completely shut. He sat alone on a rigid metal bench, listening to the chaotic, terrifying sounds of the crowded county lockup echoing down the long, concrete hallway. He had spent the last 12 hours desperately hoping that anyone would take pity on him and post his bail. He honestly believed that perhaps his former startup employees or his old college friends might pool their resources together to rescue him from this absolute nightmare. He still possessed a foolish, lingering shred of hope that his own cunning intellect would somehow miraculously provide a viable escape route from his mounting legal disasters. The heavy metal door of the cell block suddenly rattled loudly, and a tired-looking corrections officer walked down the narrow corridor carrying a thick manila envelope. Brandon immediately jumped up from the hard metal bench, ignoring the sharp, agonizing pain shooting through his bruised ribs. He gripped the thick steel bars with both of his trembling hands, his remaining good eye wide with desperate anticipation. He confidently assumed the officer was bringing him official release documents, or perhaps a formal notification that a prestigious defense attorney had finally taken his complex federal case. The stoic officer did not offer a single word of comfort or explanation. He simply slid the thick envelope through the narrow gap in the steel bars directly into Brandon's waiting hands. Brandon tore open the heavy paper seal with frantic, reckless energy, completely eager to read the details of his supposed rescue. He pulled out a massive stack of officially stamped legal documents, but the bold black heading printed across the very first page instantly destroyed his final lingering delusion. He was not looking at a bail receipt or a legal defense contract. He was looking at a formal declaration of immediate marital dissolution and a massive civil lawsuit officially filed by his own wife. The documents legally served to him while sitting inside a dirty jail cell outlined Megan's vicious demands for millions of dollars in permanent financial restitution. She was aggressively suing him for everything he supposedly owned, completely abandoning him to rot in prison while actively attempting to financially ruin whatever tiny fraction of a life he might have left. Brandon stared at the paper, his hands shaking violently as the profound, absolute betrayal finally settled deep into his bones, crushing his soul. The harsh fluorescent lights of the dark county jail cell buzzed loudly overhead as Brandon slowly sank back down onto the rigid metal bench, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his total destruction. He let the thick stack of divorce papers slip through his trembling fingers, scattering across the dirty concrete floor like worthless trash. He had officially lost absolutely everything in the span of 48 hours. The revolutionary tech company he had proudly built his entire fake identity around was entirely dismantled and reclaimed by his own father. His massive, hidden banking accounts and offshore cryptocurrency wallets were completely frozen and actively seized by federal investigators. His social standing among the wealthy city elite was permanently obliterated by the viral news broadcast and his subsequent humiliating arrest. His cowardly father-in-law Thomas had ruthlessly sold him out to the police detectives, entirely exposing every single detail of his illegal money laundering operations to secure a selfish plea deal. And now his beautiful, demanding bride, the very woman he had destroyed his entire family to impress, had viciously stabbed him in the back, filing a massive fraudulent lawsuit to extract whatever invisible wealth she incorrectly believed he still possessed. He was entirely trapped, utterly alone, and facing decades inside a maximum security federal penitentiary with absolutely no possibility of a clean escape. The crushing weight of the multiple felony charges finally broke through his stubborn delusions of grandeur, pushing his desperate mind to the absolute darkest brink of human morality. He realized that defending himself with the actual truth was completely impossible because the massive mountain of forensic evidence Jonathan had perfectly compiled against him was completely undeniable. Therefore, if he wanted to somehow avoid spending the rest of his natural life wearing a prison uniform, he needed to immediately execute the dirtiest, most unforgivable trick imaginable. He needed a perfect, vulnerable scapegoat to shoulder the entire legal blame for the massive financial crimes he had committed. He looked up at the cold steel bars, his swollen eye narrowing with a sudden, sinister determination. He was not going to take the fall alone. He firmly decided to aggressively target the absolute kindest, most gentle person in his entire world, his own disabled mother, Valerie. He began mentally plotting a horrific legal defense strategy intending to officially claim that Valerie was actually the malicious mastermind behind the entire financial forgery, and that her steadily declining neurological condition made her incredibly unstable and highly manipulative. He prepared to ruthlessly argue that he was simply a devoted son, blindly following his sick mother's confusing financial orders, completely unaware of any underlying illegal activity. It was an incredibly vile, absolutely disgusting plan, born from pure, unadulterated cowardice and sheer malice, setting the stage for the ultimate devastating courtroom showdown that would finally end everything. The heavy oak doors of the municipal courthouse swung open, revealing a crowded preliminary hearing room buzzing with toxic, nervous energy. Brandon was escorted into the courtroom wearing a bright orange county jail jumpsuit, his wrists handcuffed in front of him, completely stripped of his former arrogant executive persona. He was directed to sit at the defense table next to a severely overworked public defender he had barely spoken to since his arrest. Across the central aisle, Megan sat at the plaintiff's table wearing a perfectly tailored black designer suit, actively pretending to be a grieving, traumatized victim. She was flanked by an incredibly aggressive, high-priced divorce attorney who looked eager to absolutely destroy whatever was left of Brandon's life. The moment the presiding judge struck his wooden gavel to officially commence the preliminary hearing, the entire room instantly devolved into an absolute circus of screaming and vicious accusations. Megan's attorney immediately stood up and launched a massive aggressive attack, accusing Brandon of orchestrating a highly sophisticated web of marital fraud. He demanded the immediate liquidation of Brandon's tech company assets to compensate his deeply traumatized client for her severe emotional suffering. Brandon could not handle the blatant lies. He jumped up from his wooden chair, his chains rattling loudly, and began screaming back at his own wife. He completely abandoned any courtroom decorum, calling Megan a greedy fraud and loudly exposing how she had intentionally faked the wedding vendor invoices to steal $50,000 directly from her own father. Megan leaped out of her seat, her face twisting into a mask of pure hatred, shrieking that Brandon was a pathetic, broke criminal who was currently facing decades in federal prison. The two of them hurled absolutely horrific insults across the aisle, completely ignoring the judge, repeatedly slamming his gavel and shouting for immediate order in the court. They viciously tore each other apart in public, loudly confessing each other's darkest secrets and illegal activities in a desperate, pathetic attempt to secure the ultimate upper hand in a financial battle over a massive corporate fortune that simply did not exist anymore at all. Sitting far away from the chaotic screaming and the frantic legal posturing happening at the front of the courtroom, Valerie and I sat together in the very last row of the wooden public gallery. We were both dressed immaculately for the occasion. I wore a perfectly tailored, expensive dark navy suit with a very crisp white shirt and a silk tie, while Valerie looked absolutely breathtaking in a beautiful, long, elegant emerald green dress that perfectly complemented her warm skin. She held a classic black leather handbag securely resting gently on her lap, looking completely serene and untouched by the absolute madness unfolding directly in front of us. We did not speak a single word to each other, as we watched our abusers systematically tear each other into tiny pieces. We simply sat there in perfect peaceful silence, observing the incredible destruction of the incredibly toxic people who had arrogantly believed they could easily crush us without facing any significant consequences. It was a profoundly satisfying experience to watch them completely self-destruct using their own massive egos and overwhelming greed as their primary weapons against one another. Brandon and Megan were so entirely consumed by their blinding mutual hatred that they never even bothered to turn around and look at the gallery behind them. They had absolutely no idea that the very parents they had viciously discarded were currently sitting just a few feet away, quietly witnessing their ultimate downfall. Sitting directly beside me was my brilliant attorney Jonathan, looking completely relaxed and thoroughly entertained by the pathetic amateur legal maneuvering happening at the plaintiff's table. Jonathan held a very thick, heavily sealed manila envelope resting casually across his lap. That secure envelope contained the absolute final nails for both of their respective coffins. I gently reached over and placed my hand softly on top of Valerie's hand, giving her fingers a warm, reassuring squeeze. She turned her head slightly to look at me and offered a very small, knowing smile. The deep emotional wounds they had inflicted upon her during that terrible wedding day were finally beginning to heal, replaced by an incredible sense of permanent safety and profound justice. We were no longer the vulnerable victims they could easily push into the mud and openly laugh at without consequence. We were the silent architects of their absolute ruin, quietly waiting for the perfect moment to drop the final devastating payload onto their entirely shattered lives. We watched the intensely angry judge quickly raise his massive, heavy wooden gavel high into the air, preparing to finally silence the incredibly noisy courtroom and officially deliver a crushing legal reality that neither Brandon nor Megan could possibly anticipate or survive. The deafening crack of the heavy wooden gavel striking the solid mahogany bench echoed like a gunshot, instantly silencing the chaotic screaming match. The presiding judge glared down at Brandon and Megan with an expression of absolute disgust, completely appalled by their horrific display of pure, toxic, unfiltered greed. He adjusted his glasses and leaned forward into his microphone, his voice dripping with severe judicial contempt. He explicitly ordered Megan's highly paid aggressive divorce attorney to immediately sit down and permanently cease demanding the liquidation of the contested marital assets. The judge coldly explained that he had already thoroughly reviewed the official financial disclosures submitted to the court earlier that morning. He looked directly at Megan, who was still standing with a smug, entitled smirk on her face, and delivered the ultimate crushing reality check. He informed her that the massive corporate technology fortune she was so aggressively trying to claim completely did not exist. The judge officially declared that every single bank account, shell company, and investment portfolio linked to Brandon's name was entirely drained, officially frozen, or seized by federal authorities. He formally issued an immediate judicial order freezing all contested marital assets, officially establishing their total combined net worth at exactly $0.00. Megan's confident smirk instantly vanished entirely, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror as she realized she was fighting a vicious public battle over absolutely nothing. But the judge was not finished destroying their lives. He reached across his broad desk and picked up a thick stack of documents stamped with bright red federal seals. He announced to the entirely stunned courtroom that he had just received a highly classified sealed filing from an elite corporate attorney regarding massive ongoing financial crimes committed by both parties. Jonathan slowly stood up from his seat in the back row, holding his thick manila envelope, and confidently walked down the central aisle toward the judge's bench. The judge formally accepted Jonathan's physical evidence and then loudly declared to the entirely silent room that based upon the incredibly damning forensic documentation provided, he was legally obligated to order an immediate and massive expansion of the active criminal probe. He specifically stated that the newly expanded investigation would fully encompass both Brandon and Megan's entire families, aggressively targeting their extensive history of coordinated money laundering, felony extortion, and severe elder financial abuse. Brandon slumped entirely forward in his cold, rigid metal chair, burying his deeply bruised face in his chained hands as the inescapable reality of decades in federal prison completely crushed his spirit. Megan collapsed back into her hard wooden seat, trembling violently as she finally truly understood that her vicious, fraudulent lawsuit had miraculously backfired, ensuring her very own imminent, lengthy incarceration. The ultimate trap was perfectly executed, leaving them both completely and permanently ruined forever. Brandon sat trembling in a tiny, windowless meeting room inside the Federal Detention Center, staring across a scratched metal table at his newly appointed defense attorney. The public defender had quickly withdrawn from the case, citing a severe conflict of interest after the judge officially expanded the criminal probe. In his place, Brandon had managed to secure a sleazy, incredibly unethical private lawyer who specialized in finding dirty loopholes for highly desperate criminals. This lawyer wore a cheap, shiny suit and carried a worn leather briefcase packed with highly questionable legal strategies. He looked at Brandon and coldly explained that the federal embezzlement and forgery charges carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary. The massive mountain of forensic financial evidence was absolutely bulletproof, making a standard truthful defense completely impossible. The lawyer stated that their only viable path to freedom required them to completely destroy Valerie's personal credibility. He pulled a thick stack of heavily stamped legal and medical documents from his briefcase and slid them across the table. They were completely fabricated medical records. The sleazy attorney had somehow bribed a corrupt clinic administrator to generate a highly detailed, completely fake psychiatric evaluation, claiming that Valerie had been suffering from severe advanced dementia for the past 3 years. The fraudulent documents officially diagnosed her with profound cognitive decline, intense memory loss, and complete financial incompetence. The lawyer's disgusting strategy was to aggressively argue that Brandon never actually forged any signatures or embezzled any money. Instead, they would claim in open court that Brandon was legally and dutifully managing his sick mother's complex estate out of pure familial devotion, and that Valerie simply could not remember giving him the full legal authorization. Brandon stared at the fake medical diagnosis, his moral conscience completely obliterated by his sheer terror of spending decades in prison. He nodded slowly, eagerly, agreeing to formally submit the forged medical records to the federal judge, completely willing to publicly declare his own loving and gentle mother clinically insane just to save himself from the horrific consequences of his incredibly massive and entirely undeniable federal crimes. Less than 48 hours after that dark prison meeting, Jonathan's secure courier delivered a sealed copy of the defendant's newly filed evidentiary motion directly to my private home office. I sat behind my heavy oak desk, holding the fabricated medical records under the bright glow of my brass reading lamp. Jonathan sat in the leather armchair opposite me, watching my face closely for a reaction. Most fathers would have flown into an uncontrollable, blinding rage upon discovering that their own son was actively attempting to weaponize a fake dementia diagnosis against his gentle, disabled mother. Most men would have immediately called the federal prosecutor to angrily scream about the blatant injustice of such a vile, desperate legal maneuver. I did absolutely none of those things. I simply adjusted my reading glasses, scanned the official letterhead printed at the very top of the fraudulent psychiatric report, and allowed a very slow, incredibly cold smile to spread across my face. I handed the forged document back to Jonathan, pointing directly at the brightly colored logo of the medical clinic that had supposedly issued the damning evaluation. Brandon and his sleazy defense attorney had chosen an upscale private neurological facility located on the affluent west side of the city, assuming its prestigious reputation would lend undeniable credibility to their disgusting lies. It was a spectacularly fatal miscalculation driven by their shared blinding arrogance and complete lack of fundamental research. They had absolutely no idea that the prestigious neurological clinic they had just used to manufacture their fake evidence was primarily sustained by a massive annual philanthropic grant. That generous grant was entirely funded governed and strictly overseen by my own private charity foundation. I was not just a wealthy anonymous donor to that specific medical facility. I was the active chairman of their primary financial oversight board. I personally knew the chief medical director, the head of neurology, and every single senior administrator working in that building. I knew with absolute scientific certainty that Valerie had never once been a registered patient at that facility, and that the attending physician whose signature was currently forged at the bottom of the document had been attending a medical conference in Europe on the exact date the evaluation was supposedly conducted. Brandon had quite literally tried to use my own deeply guarded charitable institution to legally destroy my wife. I looked over at Jonathan, who was already grinning, matching my cold, quiet satisfaction. We did not need to shout or throw any angry, pathetic tantrums. Our incredibly foolish enemy had just willingly walked blindfolded into a highly secure vault and locked the heavy steel door securely shut directly from the very dark inside now forever. My brilliant lawyer Jonathan completely understood the incredible magnitude of the fatal error Brandon had just committed. A standard defense attorney would immediately file a loud and aggressive motion to strike the fraudulent document from the official court record, claiming obvious fabrication and demanding an immediate dismissal. But Jonathan was far more ruthless and far more strategic than a standard attorney. He did not file a single objection to the fake medical records. He did not notify the federal prosecutor about the blatant forgery or alert the presiding judge to the highly illegal deception. Instead, Jonathan intentionally allowed the fraudulent documents to be officially entered into the permanent federal court record without any resistance whatsoever. By remaining completely silent and passive, Jonathan actively encouraged Brandon and his sleazy lawyer to build their entire criminal defense strategy upon a foundation of absolute verifiable lies. Early the very next morning, Jonathan drove directly to the federal courthouse and filed an entirely different type of legal motion. He formally requested a rapid, immediate emergency sworn deposition, forcing Brandon to answer direct questions under the strict penalty of federal perjury prior to the official commencement of the main criminal trial. He cleverly framed the urgent request as a necessary procedural step to properly understand the exact scope of Valerie's newly alleged cognitive impairment. Brandon's incredibly arrogant defense attorney completely mistook Jonathan's passive silence for severe legal panic. He eagerly agreed to the sworn deposition, foolishly believing that Jonathan was completely intimidated by the fake medical records and was desperately seeking a quick, quiet settlement to protect Valerie's public dignity. They walked right into the invisible trap with their heads held high, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was about to permanently collapse. The deposition was officially scheduled for the following week inside a highly secure, windowless conference room at the federal courthouse. Brandon was going to be forced to sit down in front of a licensed court reporter, raise his right hand, and swear a sacred binding oath to tell the complete, absolute truth. Jonathan was preparing to slowly and methodically guide Brandon into repeatedly authenticating the fraudulent medical documents on the official federal record. Every single lie Brandon told to validate the fake dementia diagnosis would be permanently transcribed and legally weaponized against him. The moment Brandon verbally confirmed the validity of that forged clinic report under oath, he would instantly commit undeniable documented federal perjury, adding another massive layer of inescapable felony charges to his already doomed existence. I sat in my quiet study, completely at peace, knowing that my son was currently sitting in a dirty jail cell, actively celebrating his brilliant fake medical defense, entirely oblivious to the terrifying reality that he had just handed us the exact rope we needed to hang him permanently, completely without any possible escape routes. The heavy wooden door of the secure federal conference room clicked shut, sealing Brandon inside the windowless space for his emergency sworn deposition. The room was incredibly cold, completely devoid of any natural light or comforting features. A licensed federal court reporter sat quietly in the corner, adjusting her stenography machine and preparing to permanently record every single spoken syllable. Brandon sat at the long, polished table wearing a highly uncomfortable borrowed suit, looking nervously at his sleazy defense attorney. Jonathan sat directly across from them, maintaining a perfectly blank professional expression while opening a very thin legal file. The court reporter formally administered the binding federal oath, asking Brandon to raise his right hand and swear to tell the complete, absolute truth under the severe penalty of perjury. Brandon confidently lowered his hand, believing this closed-door meeting was his guaranteed ticket to freedom. His defense attorney immediately launched into a highly aggressive, rehearsed theatrical performance. The sleazy lawyer began pacing around the small room, deliberately raising his voice to ensure the microphone captured his faux righteous indignation. He aggressively insulted Valerie's mental state, painting a horrifying picture of a woman who was completely detached from reality. He described her as severely incompetent, highly confused, and entirely incapable of managing even the simplest daily tasks. The attorney looked directly at Brandon and asked leading questions designed to explicitly validate the fabricated medical narrative. He forcefully asked if Valerie frequently forgot her own name, wandered aimlessly around the neighborhood, and desperately required full-time financial guardianship to survive. Brandon nodded eagerly, leaning into the microphone and publicly agreeing with every single disgusting insult directed at his own mother. The defense attorney then placed the forged medical clinic report directly onto the table. He pushed Brandon to formally confirm under oath that he had specifically relied upon this exact medical authority when he took complete control of the family finances. Brandon stared at the fake document and smiled inwardly, completely convinced that this brilliant legal strategy was working flawlessly. He loudly and proudly confirmed his absolute reliance on the diagnosis without any shred of hesitation. Jonathan waited patiently for the defense attorney to finish his dramatic questioning before finally speaking. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the polished table, and looked directly into Brandon's eyes. Jonathan did not display any anger or raise his voice to challenge the ridiculous medical claims. Instead, he adopted a remarkably gentle and highly cooperative tone, entirely disarming the defense strategy. He politely asked Brandon to personally examine the medical report resting on the table and verify its physical authenticity for the official court record. Brandon eagerly picked up the fraudulent paperwork, his confidence surging, as he mistakenly assumed my formidable corporate attorney was actually surrendering to the brilliant defense tactic. Jonathan methodically walked Brandon through every single detail printed on those forged pages. He asked Brandon to explicitly confirm the name of the prestigious neurological clinic printed at the very top of the document. Brandon loudly read the name into the microphone, proudly asserting that it was the absolute best medical facility in the entire state. Jonathan then asked him to verify the specific date of the supposed medical examination. Brandon confidently stated the exact date, claiming he had personally driven his deeply confused mother to that specific appointment. The trap was slowly tightening with every single arrogant word Brandon spoke. Jonathan continued to expertly guide the conversation, pushing Brandon to completely double down on the authenticity of the attending physician's signature located at the bottom of the final page. Jonathan softly asked if Brandon was entirely certain, without any shadow of a doubt, that this specific doctor had physically evaluated Valerie on that exact afternoon. Brandon's sleazy lawyer nodded encouragingly, completely blind to the lethal danger actively circling them. Brandon puffed out his chest, leaning aggressively toward the court reporter, and firmly declared that he was absolutely certain about the medical report's complete legitimacy. He swore that he vividly remembered speaking directly to that specific neurologist in the clinic waiting room immediately after the extensive cognitive tests were concluded. He fabricated an entire conversation completely out of thin air, adding unnecessary vivid details to his massive federal lie just to make his fake story sound more incredibly convincing. Jonathan simply nodded, writing a tiny checkmark on his legal pad. He asked Brandon one final clarifying question, ensuring there was no possible room for a future misunderstanding. He asked if Brandon was officially presenting this specific document as undeniable factual evidence under the strict penalty of perjury. He explicitly warned him that lying to a federal official would result in severe additional criminal charges, completely destroying any remaining hope for leniency during the upcoming criminal trial. Brandon forcefully answered yes, instantly sealing his incredibly dark and permanent fate. The moment the loud, affirming syllable left Brandon's mouth, the court reporter firmly pressed the final combination of keys on her machine, instantly locking his sworn testimony into the permanent federal court record. Jonathan stopped writing and slowly closed his thin leather notepad. The remarkably gentle, cooperative demeanor he had brilliantly displayed for the past hour vanished entirely, replaced by a gaze of incredibly sharp, absolute ruthlessness. Jonathan leaned back in his comfortable chair and calmly informed Brandon that his deposition was now officially concluded. He then opened a secondary file sitting quietly on the table. Jonathan did not shout or gloat. He simply read aloud a certified affidavit directly from the chief medical director of the very same prestigious neurological clinic Brandon had just loudly praised. Jonathan meticulously explained that I was the primary financial benefactor and active board chairman of that specific medical facility. He presented undeniably authentic flight records, proving that the attending physician whose signature appeared on the fraudulent report was physically attending a medical conference in Switzerland on the exact day Valerie was supposedly examined. He also provided official clinic database logs proving Valerie had never once stepped foot inside their building. Brandon's sleazy defense attorney instantly turned a horrific shade of pale white, completely realizing the massive lethal trap they had just arrogantly walked into. He began frantically packing his worn leather briefcase, desperately stammering apologies to the silent court reporter, entirely attempting to physically distance himself from his deeply doomed client. Brandon sat completely paralyzed in his borrowed suit, unable to breathe as the terrifying realization finally crushed his chest. By aggressively doubling down and proudly validating the fabricated medical report under a binding federal oath, he had just handed the prosecution an absolutely perfect documented case of severe felony perjury. He had completely destroyed his only remaining defensive strategy in a matter of minutes. The federal prosecutor, who had been quietly monitoring the deposition via a secure audio feed, immediately filed supplementary criminal charges before Brandon could even stand up from the polished table. Committing such a blatant, severe perjury directly in front of a licensed federal official automatically rendered Brandon completely ineligible for any future leniency programs or negotiated plea deals. His sleazy lawyer rushed out of the secure conference room, completely abandoning him to his ultimate destruction. Brandon was left sitting entirely alone, staring blankly at the highly detailed, authentic affidavits that had just permanently erased his entire future. The absolute darkest penalty for his immense arrogance was no longer just a terrifying possibility hanging over his head. It was now an inescapable reality securely locked in the federal archives, perfectly ensuring he would spend the remainder of his adult life inside a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely stripped of his pride, his stolen wealth, and his freedom forever without any second chance. The highly anticipated main criminal trial officially began 3 weeks later inside a massive federal courtroom heavily guarded by armed security personnel. Brandon sat confidently at the defense table wearing a standard gray prison suit, completely masking his previous internal panic with a fresh layer of immense manufactured arrogance. Despite the disastrous sworn deposition where he had foolishly doubled down on the fabricated medical report, his sleazy defense attorney had successfully convinced him that they could still easily win the case. The attorney's desperate legal theory relied entirely on the arrogant assumption that I simply did not possess the immense financial resources required to hire a world-renowned medical expert to formally challenge their forged documents in open court. Brandon looked across the central aisle at me, sitting quietly in the front row next to my beautiful wife, Valerie. He sneered deeply and firmly, believing his own incredibly toxic delusions. He honestly thought I was just a bitter retired plumber who had merely gotten lucky with a few hidden corporate investments. He blindly assumed my wealth was highly illiquid and that I would never be able to afford the exorbitant hourly rates commanded by top-tier neurological specialists. He leaned over and whispered a cruel joke into his lawyer's ear, confident that the federal prosecutor would only present a low-level local doctor who could be easily confused and aggressively discredited during cross-examination. Brandon fully expected to walk out of that federal courthouse a completely free man, ready to rebuild his fraudulent tech empire. He arrogantly adjusted his collar, staring directly at the federal judge with a smug, entitled expression, entirely ready to publicly humiliate his own disabled mother just to secure his own selfish freedom. He had absolutely no idea that the prosecution was not planning to call a standard local doctor to the witness stand today. He was completely oblivious to the terrifying reality that the ultimate devastating weapon was currently waiting patiently just outside the heavy oak courtroom doors, ready to permanently obliterate his fake medical defense and legally bury him forever under an absolute mountain of undeniable scientific truth. The federal prosecutor stood up from his desk, adjusting his tie, and formally announced to the presiding judge that the government was ready to call its primary medical expert to the witness stand. The heavy, solid oak doors at the back of the massive courtroom slowly swung open, capturing the immediate attention of every single person in the gallery. A tall, distinguished older man wearing a perfectly tailored dark charcoal suit walked confidently down the central aisle. He carried a highly professional black leather briefcase and moved with an undeniable air of absolute clinical authority. Brandon squinted his eyes, trying to identify the imposing stranger, completely unaware of the absolute magnitude of the terrifying threat steadily approaching his front defense table. The armed bailiff formally swore the older man in, asking him to clearly state his full legal name and current professional medical occupation for the official binding court record. The distinguished gentleman leaned forward into the microphone, his deep, commanding voice echoing clearly throughout the large, silent room. He introduced himself as the acting chief of neurology at the single most prestigious research hospital in the entire nation, holding multiple advanced medical degrees and commanding over 4 decades of elite clinical experience. He was a widely and globally recognized pioneer in the precise scientific diagnosis and highly advanced treatment of extremely complex neurodegenerative diseases. Brandon's sleazy defense attorney instantly dropped his expensive luxury gold pen, entirely paralyzed by sheer unadulterated terror and panic, as the undeniable weight of the witness' legendary credentials heavily crushed their pathetic, fabricated defense strategy. But the ultimate devastating revelation was completely hidden from the official medical paperwork. The brilliant neurologist sitting on the witness stand was not merely a randomly hired expert witness brought in by the federal government. He was my absolute closest personal friend of over 30 incredible years. We had played golf together every single Sunday morning, shared wonderful family holidays, and fiercely supported each other through decades of massive corporate and intense personal challenges. He had personally known my beautiful Valerie since the very first day I lovingly proposed to her, and he was intimately familiar with the exact, precise reality of her entirely physical multiple sclerosis diagnosis, completely confirming her mind remained absolutely brilliantly sharp. He had eagerly volunteered to completely obliterate Brandon's horrific lies the exact moment Jonathan showed him the forged psychiatric evaluation. I slowly looked up at my dearest friend sitting calmly on the elevated wooden witness stand and respectfully offered him a very brief, knowing nod. He quickly returned the subtle gesture, perfectly ready to systematically dismantle my highly arrogant son using the absolute undeniable power of pure objective medical science and fiercely loyal friendship. The federal prosecutor smoothly handed the fabricated medical report to the chief neurologist, formally requesting his expert professional analysis of the submitted document. The brilliant doctor adjusted his reading glasses and stared at the fake psychiatric evaluation for less than 10 seconds before letting out a sharp, completely dismissive scoff. He looked directly at the 12 members of the federal jury and began to methodically shred the fraudulent defense strategy using incredibly precise, undeniable scientific evidence. He confidently stated that the specific cognitive tests referenced in the forged document had been completely obsolete in the advanced medical community for over 15 years. He pointed out multiple glaring anatomical impossibilities in the written diagnosis, proving that whoever drafted the fake report possessed absolutely zero authentic neurological training. The courtroom remained completely captivated as he entirely dismantled the physical paperwork. He explicitly noted the forged signature of the attending physician, formally presenting the official, highly detailed flight records, perfectly proving his colleague was physically lecturing at a prestigious medical conference in Switzerland on the exact day Valerie was supposedly examined. Then, looking directly at the deeply stunned jury, he forcefully delivered the ultimate fatal crushing blow. He very firmly declared under strict federal oath that he had personally examined Valerie less than 1 month ago, and that her incredibly sharp mind tested in the highest possible percentile for her age group. He forcefully and passionately testified that her highly manageable multiple sclerosis was strictly a physical ailment that absolutely never impacted her brilliant cognitive abilities. Brandon sat entirely frozen at the defense table, his bruised face draining of all remaining color as his entire elaborate web of malicious lies was publicly violently incinerated. His sleazy defense attorney immediately recognized the absolute sheer terror of his current legal position. The lawyer knew that presenting deliberately fabricated evidence to a federal judge was an extremely severe felony that would result in his immediate disbarment and incredibly lengthy imprisonment. The sleazy attorney began sweating profusely, violently shuffling his legal papers and hyperventilating in sheer unadulterated panic. Before the prosecutor could even finish asking his next question, the defense attorney abruptly jumped up from his wooden chair, practically knocking it over backwards. He stammered wildly, waving his hands in the air, and frantically begged the presiding judge for an immediate emergency recess. He loudly formally moved to instantly withdraw from the case as the primary defense counsel actively claiming a massive sudden conflict of ethical interest. He threw his expensive files into his briefcase and desperately physically distanced himself from Brandon, publicly abandoning his deeply doomed client right in the middle of the crowded courtroom. Brandon was left sitting entirely, completely alone at the large defense table, staring blankly ahead as the heavy gavel slammed down, perfectly sealing his absolute final inescapable destruction forever without any possibility of rescue. The day of the final sentencing arrived with a heavy, suffocating atmosphere settling over the grand federal courtroom. Brandon stood completely alone at the polished wooden podium wearing the bright orange county jail uniform that had become his permanent wardrobe. His wrists and ankles were bound by heavy steel chains that rattled loudly against the hardwood floor every time he shifted his weight. His sleazy private defense attorney had officially withdrawn from the case, leaving Brandon with a highly overworked public defender who stood silently beside him, completely resigned to the inevitable, devastating outcome. Across the wide central aisle, Megan sat rigidly at her own defense table, accompanied by a separate state-appointed lawyer. She looked absolutely terrible. Her previously pristine blonde hair now dull and unkempt, her expensive designer clothes replaced by the exact same drab prison orange. They did not even look at each other. The toxic bond that had fueled their immense arrogance was entirely destroyed, replaced by a bitter, suffocating mutual hatred. The presiding federal judge, a stern older man with absolutely zero tolerance for white-collar criminals, was actively reviewing the massive stack of pre-sentencing reports resting on his elevated mahogany bench. The absolute crushing weight of the multiple federal convictions finally settled directly onto Brandon's incredibly frail shoulders. He knew he was completely out of options, out of money, and entirely out of lies. In a final act of pure, desperate cowardice, Brandon slowly turned his head away from the judge's bench and looked back into the crowded public gallery. His swollen, bruised face carried an expression of absolute pathetic terror. He searched the rows of wooden benches until his eyes finally locked onto me and Valerie sitting perfectly still in the very front row. He stared directly at us, his bottom lip trembling violently, desperately searching for just one single shred of parental mercy. He silently pleaded with, his eyes begging us to somehow stand up and miraculously intervene to save him from the terrifying darkness rapidly closing in around him, right here in this incredibly cold and unforgiving federal courtroom building, completely alone right now. I sat next to Valerie with my hands folded, neatly resting on my lap, looking straight back into my son's desperate, terrified eyes. I did not move a single muscle. I did not offer him a comforting nod of reassurance, nor did I angrily turn my head away in disgust. I simply stared at him with a perfectly blank, completely emotionless expression, allowing the incredibly heavy silence between us to speak volumes. In that highly intense passing moment, Brandon finally realized the absolute true severity of his horrific actions. He had spent his entire adult life aggressively manipulating my generosity, actively treating my quiet, unwavering support as a massive weakness he could continuously exploit for his own selfish gain. He had watched his incredibly arrogant bride violently shove his own disabled mother into the dirty mud, and he had chosen to laugh directly in our faces, completely discarding the very family that had unconditionally loved him. He had callously forged Valerie's signature illegally, mortgaging her highly sacred ancestral land to secretly fund his pathetic fake corporate empire, and when cornered by federal authorities, he had viciously attempted to permanently destroy her mental credibility, actively bringing fabricated medical records into a federal courthouse just to save his own miserable skin. There was absolutely no parental warmth left inside my heart for the man currently standing in chains at that podium. My silent, unblinking gaze was the ultimate final judgment. A completely impenetrable wall of absolute cold reality that permanently severed the paternal bond we once shared. Valerie sat beside me, radiating an identical aura of calm, incredibly powerful stoicism. She did not shed a single tear for her son today. She had already mourned the tragic loss of the loving boy she had raised many months ago, fully accepting that the incredibly toxic criminal standing before the judge was an entirely different person altogether. Brandon stared at us for several long, agonizing seconds, his chest heaving violently as he desperately tried to find a tiny hidden crack in our solid, unified front. He found absolutely nothing but empty space. We were no longer his permanent safety net, his reliable financial bailout, or his endless source of unconditional forgiveness. We were exactly what he had originally asked us to be, entirely, completely absent from his life right here and now. His breathing hitched, loudly echoing across the silent courtroom as his remaining fragile hope, entirely shattered into millions of tiny, irrecoverable pieces. He slowly turned his head back toward the elevated mahogany bench, his shoulders slumping completely forward, entirely broken and utterly alone, preparing to finally face the absolute massive, unyielding wrath of the federal criminal justice system without any protective shield. The federal judge adjusted his silver reading glasses and formally instructed both defendants to stand completely upright and face the elevated mahogany bench for their final official sentencing. Brandon struggled to pull himself up, his heavy steel chains scraping loudly against the polished wood, while Megan stood rigidly at her separate table, staring straight ahead with blank, terrified eyes. The judge did not hold back his absolute immense disgust. He began by directly addressing Brandon, speaking in a booming voice that echoed powerfully across the grand room. He explicitly detailed the massive, horrifying scope of Brandon's multiple calculated financial crimes, emphasizing the absolutely detestable decision to repeatedly exploit and actively endanger his own vulnerable, disabled mother. The judge firmly stated that such a severe, breathtaking level of calculated familial betrayal, combined with the incredible arrogance required to boldly commit blatant federal perjury directly inside a secure deposition room, demanded the absolute harshest possible penalty under the strict federal sentencing guidelines currently available to the court system today. The judge paused, letting the incredibly heavy silence hang in the air before delivering the ultimate fatal, crushing blow. He formally sentenced Brandon to 15 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely without any possibility of early parole for the combined severe felony charges of grand corporate embezzlement, massive wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and undeniable documented federal perjury. Brandon let out a horrifying, guttural sob, instantly collapsing back into his wooden chair as the terrifying reality of spending the absolute prime of his adult life locked inside a tiny concrete cell fully destroyed his mind. The judge then immediately turned his fierce, unwavering attention directly toward Megan. He coldly reprimanded her for violently assaulting an innocent elderly woman entirely driven by pure superficial greed and incredibly toxic social entitlement. He formally sentenced Megan to 5 full years in a federal correctional facility for felony physical assault and severe financial forgery, permanently erasing her pathetic, glamorous fake lifestyle. The loud, deafening crack of the heavy wooden gavel striking the solid bench echoed like a massive gunshot, officially signaling the absolute permanent end of the entire legal proceedings. The armed federal marshals immediately stepped forward forcefully, grabbing both Brandon and Megan by their shoulders to aggressively escort them out of the courtroom toward the holding cells. Their incredibly toxic, massive delusions of unearned elite wealth, unpunished arrogance, and untouchable corporate power were finally entirely, completely shattered forever, without any hope for a future revival. I stood up slowly, offering my steady arm to my beautiful wife Valerie, as we calmly walked out of the massive federal building, entirely leaving our terrible abusers behind us in the dark, completely ready to finally begin the rest of our incredibly quiet and wonderful, peaceful lives together, free from their intense, endless chaos completely and forever. Starting today. 2 incredibly peaceful years have quietly passed since the heavy wooden gavel slammed down inside that cold federal courtroom, permanently sealing the absolute fate of the toxic individuals who arrogantly attempted to destroy my beautiful family. The passage of time has been remarkably kind to us, but it has been incredibly ruthless to those who chose the path of pure selfish greed. Brandon is currently serving his 15-year mandatory sentence locked away inside a dark, brutal, maximum security federal penitentiary located entirely across the vast country, far from any familiar comforts. His days of wearing tailored designer suits and pretending to be a revolutionary tech visionary are completely over. He now wears a faded, oversized orange jumpsuit and spends exactly 12 hours every single day scrubbing filthy concrete floors and cleaning incredibly disgusting prison toilets for mere pennies an hour. He has no wealthy investors to impress and absolutely no fancy corporate titles to hide behind. His massive arrogance has been entirely stripped away, leaving nothing but a profoundly broken and incredibly bitter man trapped inside a tiny, sterile cell. He pitifully attempts to frantically call me every single month on the designated prison visitation day, hoping for forgiveness. But I permanently blocked his official identification number long ago because I have absolutely nothing left to formally say to him or his memory. Meanwhile, his former father-in-law Thomas is experiencing his own personal version of absolute hell. After barely surviving a brutal physical beating from the underground loan sharks, Thomas completely lost his massive luxury home, his expensive vehicles, and his entire fake aristocratic reputation. He is currently living out of a heavily rusted, dilapidated van, parked permanently in a highly dangerous trailer park on the absolute poorest outskirts of the city. He spends his days collecting scrap metal just to afford cheap meals, completely terrified of his own shadow and entirely abandoned by the high society friends he once desperately tried to impress. The ultimate crushing price of their immense arrogance was completely extracted in the most brutal fashion imaginable, leaving their fraudulent, pathetic lives entirely in absolute ruins forever. While our pathetic former abusers actively continue to slowly rot away in the incredibly dark, damp, completely isolated corners of their very own, incredibly miserable. Making my beautiful wife Valerie and I are currently standing closely together under the bright, warm morning sun, happily celebrating an incredibly beautiful and profound new beginning. We are standing on the pristine front steps of a massive, beautifully designed modern building located directly in the heart of the downtown civic district. Today is the highly anticipated grand opening and the official ribbon-cutting public ceremony for a massive, brand-new state-of-the-art legal aid defense center dedicated entirely to aggressively protecting highly vulnerable elderly citizens from severe financial and malicious emotional abuse. The towering modern glass facility is fully staffed with elite prosecuting attorneys, highly dedicated social workers, and incredibly well-trained forensic financial auditors who will tirelessly ensure that no innocent senior citizen in this entire vast city ever falls victim to the incredibly toxic, selfish greed of their very own ungrateful, abusive children. This massive, gorgeous, multi-million-dollar philanthropic project was completely funded using the exact money our brilliant attorney Jonathan aggressively legally seized and meticulously liquidated directly from Brandon's fraudulent banking accounts and shattered tech company assets. We took the dirty money that was intentionally stolen through sheer malice and effectively transformed it into a permanent shining beacon of absolute justice and unyielding protection. Valerie looks absolutely radiant today, wearing a stunning yellow dress that perfectly captures her incredibly joyful spirit. Her health has improved dramatically over the past 2 years, completely free from the intense daily toxic stress and severe emotional burden our selfish son constantly placed upon her shoulders. She is currently smiling incredibly broadly, gracefully holding a heavy pair of large, shiny silver ceremonial scissors firmly in her soft hands, actively preparing to cut the incredibly thick red ribbon stretched tightly across the wide main glass entrance doors. Jonathan is standing proudly right beside us, clapping loudly and actively managing the large crowd of grateful community members, local politicians, and eager journalists who have gathered to witness this incredible triumph of genuine justice. I reach out and gently wrap my arm around Valerie's waist, pulling her close as she firmly snips the red ribbon directly in half. The large crowd erupts into enthusiastic cheering and joyful applause, instantly echoing off the towering glass walls of the new building. It is a profoundly moving experience to physically watch the immense pain of our incredibly dark past seamlessly transform into such a tremendously powerful and positive force for the entire community, completely ensuring that our difficult personal struggle ultimately served a much higher and noble purpose for the future. As the joyful cheering continues to echo around us, I look out at the beautiful smiling faces of the massive crowd, feeling an overwhelming sense of absolute, unshakable peace settling deeply into my soul. The incredible toxic storm that once violently threatened to completely tear our quiet lives apart has officially passed, entirely clearing the dark skies and leaving behind a tremendously strong foundation built entirely on mutual respect and unconditional, genuine love. The rotting branches of our family tree were completely severed and painfully discarded, but doing so incredibly allowed the healthy roots to finally receive the bright sunlight they desperately needed to truly flourish and vigorously grow. I spent many long years making the incredibly dangerous mistake of blindly confusing my quiet, stoic silence with actual protective strength. I firmly believed that if I simply absorbed the painful insults, quietly paid the massive hidden bills endlessly, and silently tolerated the deep, blatant disrespect from my arrogant son, I was somehow being a truly noble and incredibly good father. But the absolute harshest lesson I ultimately learned is that allowing toxic people to completely trample your boundaries never actually fixes their severely broken behavior. It only loudly teaches them that your profound pain is an entirely acceptable price to pay for their massive selfish convenience. Silence is not a protective shield when you are aggressively dealing with incredibly greedy, narcissistic individuals. It is merely a very dangerous trap that steadily enables their absolute worst, terrifying impulses. True family is not simply determined by shared bloodlines or a legally binding marriage certificate. True family is exclusively defined by consistent, unwavering mutual respect, genuine, fierce loyalty, and a deep, profound love that is absolutely never weaponized or maliciously used to inflict severe emotional harm. When my foolish son explicitly chose to openly laugh while his cruel bride aggressively shoved his disabled mother into the dirty mud, he officially proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that he was no longer family. He officially became a highly dangerous, toxic threat, and I systematically eliminated that dark threat with the exact same cold, ruthless efficiency I utilized to build my massive corporate empire over the past 4 incredible decades. The disgusting trash quite literally took itself completely out, permanently destroying their own miserable lives through sheer, blinding, arrogant entitlement. Valerie and I are finally free from their constant, toxic, suffocating weight, ready to embrace the wonderful, peaceful twilight of our beautiful lives. Thank you so much for listening to my dramatic story today. If you have ever had to firmly stand your ground and forcefully cut toxic, manipulative people completely out of your own life, please share your personal experiences in the comments section below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories about absolute justice and finding genuine inner peace. I also learned that wealth is an incredibly dangerous illusion when it is entirely disconnected from genuine hard work and basic moral integrity. Brandon believed my money automatically made him a brilliant genius, completely blinding him to the undeniable reality that true power always resides in discipline, not extravagant spending. You must fiercely protect your personal legacy from entitled relatives who only value your bank account. Never allow your profound love to become a convenient tool for their selfish financial exploitation. If you found this story inspiring, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share your thoughts today.